Hey everyone, tonight we drift back to a quieter, lonelier corner of the Middle Ages, a time when the banners of war had fallen silent and a certain kind of man, the knight, found himself standing in a world that no longer needed him. Imagine the year somewhere between the 14th and early 15th centuries. The long wars have ended, the castles are crumbling, the lords are dying without heirs, and the code of chivalry that once shaped entire lives is starting to feel more like a myth than a duty. And there, in the midst of it all, stands a man in rusting armor, a knight without a lord. No orders to follow, no oaths to uphold, no feast to attend, just the sound of wind against the stone walls of a forgotten manor, and the slow passing of days that no longer belong to him. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how many of us are awake together, scattered across time zones, wandering through history at the same quiet hour. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a soft fan, or let the night sounds play in the background. Let the noise of the day fade away. We're about to travel back, not to battles or conquests, but to what came after them. Let's begin tonight's story, what life was like for a medieval knight without a lord. The year was somewhere in the late 14th century, though no chronicler would bother recording the exact date of a single man's quiet ruin. The fields of Europe were changing. Long stretches of land that had once echoed with the thunder of hooves now lay open to plough and sheep. The wars that had once defined generations had paused, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. And among the crumbling keeps and empty barracks, a man who had lived his life by the sword found himself with no cause left to serve. He had been a knight, one of thousands bound by oath, duty, and the thin threads of feudal allegiance that stretched from serf to monarch. For years, perhaps decades, those threads had guided his every decision. To whom he swore fealty, for whom he raised his sword, when he marched, when he rested. All were decided by the hierarchy that shaped medieval life. But now, as lords fell without heirs, and monarchs struggled to pay their vassals, those threads were fraying. The great tapestry of feudal Europe, woven with oaths and obligations, was beginning to unweave itself. In the silence of his small hall, he could still see the banner. Once it had hung above his bed, its colors bright, its heraldic sigil sharp against the cloth. It represented his lineage and his loyalty, the proof of a life defined by service. But now it lay folded in a chest, its colors dulled by time and dust. His lord had died during a border skirmish years ago, and the heir had never returned from the sea. The estate had passed into the hands of a distant cousin, who sold it to a merchant. The banner, once sacred, no longer meant anything. The knight had been paid in land, a few small fields, and a manor of modest stone, in exchange for his years of service. But without the support of a feudal overlord, the manor fell into neglect. Roof timbers sagged, the well grew dry, and the tenants drifted away to villages where taxes were lighter and lords less demanding. The knight's own coffers, once replenished by his share of spoils and tribute, were nearly empty. His armor stood rusting in the corner, still whole, but too heavy for daily life. It was a strange sort of end for a man who had once lived by ritual, morning drills, vespers, the inspection of horses and weapons, the prayers before each campaign. These had structured his existence. Without them, time seemed to lose meaning. The seasons changed, but his life remained fixed in stillness. The sound of church bells carried faintly from the valley below, marking hours for those who still worked the land. But for him, each bell only reminded him that his own sense of purpose had fallen silent. The fading of the feudal system was not sudden. It crept through Europe like mist over a battlefield. The Black Death had already thinned the population, leaving many manors deserted. With fewer peasants to till the soil, surviving workers demanded better wages, or simply left for towns where guilds offered steady pay. Lords, weakened by debts from endless wars, could no longer maintain their retinues. The 100 Years' War had drawn thousands of knights into long service, but when peace came, or something resembling it, many returned home to find nothing left. The knight in this story was one of them. He had ridden for both defense and conquest, had guarded supply trains, and had endured winters so cold that steel froze to his hands. He had fought not for greed, but for the simple fulfillment of duty, that word which had guided his entire life. Yet now, standing alone in a courtyard overgrown with weeds, he could not define what that duty meant anymore. He still prayed before dawn. It was habit, not conviction. The words of the Psalms were familiar, but their meaning had dulled, like a blade blunted by years of use. His prayers were not for victory or forgiveness now, merely for clarity. He wondered what became of a man, when his role in the world vanished. Was a knight without a lord, still a knight, or merely a man wearing memories like armor? The social order around him continued to shift. In towns, merchants grew rich through trade, buying influence once held only by nobility. Castles, once symbols of power, became impractical relics. Stone fortifications could not compete with the reach of longbows and the thunder of early cannon. Even warfare itself was changing, less reliant on the mounted cavalry charge that had defined chivalric combat. The knightly ideal, courage, loyalty, honor, felt increasingly out of place in a world ruled by commerce and negotiation. In the evenings, he would sit near the dying fire, oiling his sword, though he knew he would never draw it again. The ritual comforted him, a reminder of the days when everything had a purpose, when the gleam of metal was a promise of safety and control. Now it was only reflection, the pale light of fire on steel, a ghost of meaning. Sometimes travelers passed along the road near his estate, peddlers, monks, the occasional soldier seeking work. They would nod respectfully, but their eyes lingered on the neglected manor, the faded sigil carved above the gate. They knew what he was, one of the old kind, left behind by history. He rarely spoke to them. The art of conversation had once been shaped by ceremony, greetings, deference, the acknowledgement of rank. But what rank was left now? Even the nearby priest, who once addressed him as Sir, now simply called him by name. It was not disrespect, merely the world settling into new hierarchies where land and lineage no longer defined worth. The winters grew longer. The banners of his youth, those brilliant tapestries of crimson, gold and azure that once hung in the great halls of lords, were being taken down across the realm, replaced by the simple emblems of town councils and merchant guilds. The knight watched these changes from a distance, feeling less anger than quiet resignation. The age of the banner had ended, and with it, the age of men like him. There was no final battle, no clear collapse. Only a gradual dimming of titles, of banners, of purpose. What had begun as a structure of loyalty had dissolved into a quiet confusion. Yet in that confusion something else was being born, a new kind of life that did not depend on fealty or war. The knight could sense it, even if he could not yet understand it. As the years turned, and the fields once owned by nobles became communal farmlands or merchant holdings, he realized he was witnessing a transformation larger than himself. The medieval world was closing, slowly, gently, like a book after its final page. The last thing he did each night was look toward the folded banner in its chest, the symbol of a world that had already forgotten him. And when he finally extinguished the candle, the faint smell of wax and dust filled the room, mingling with the quiet rustle of wind through the cracks in the wall. And so the story continues, as the empty hall waits for its master to understand what life means when the banner is gone, and the hearth burns only for memory. Morning came without fanfare. A thin mist clung to the fields, softening the edges of the hedgerows and dulling the outlines of distant trees. The knight rose from his narrow bed, joints stiff with age and the damp air, and moved slowly through the half-lit corridors of the manor. The stone walls, once echoing with footsteps and voices, now gave back only silence. The great hall, his hall, had once been the center of everything. It was here that banners had hung, their colours bold against the pale plaster. Here, too, the long oak table had stood polished and sturdy, bearing the weight of roasted meats, bread trenchers and flagons of ale. Laughter had once risen to the rafters, mingling with the music of lutes and pipes. There had been noise, purpose, movement, life. Now the hall was bare. The rushes on the floor had grown stale, and the fire pit, once constantly stoked, was filled with cold ash. A few broken chairs leaned against the walls. Sunlight filtered through the high, narrow windows in thin grey ribbons, illuminating the dust that hung motionless in the air. He paused by the hearth, looking down at the soot-blackened stones, and could almost hear the echo of the old warmth, that familiar crackle of burning logs, the low hum of conversation after a meal. It was a strange feeling to stand amid one's own life as if visiting a ruin. His retainers, the squires, the steward, the cook, the handful of servants, had all gone. One by one they had drifted away as the manor's fortunes waned. Some had sought work in the growing towns, others had married into peasant families, or joined the clergy. Only a single groundsman remained, an old man who kept to himself and rarely spoke except to say that the roof still held, though it leaked. The knight moved to the long table and ran a hand across its surface. Dust rose, catching the light. Beneath his fingers he could still feel the faint scars left by countless meals, the knife marks, the small burned rings from candle holders. Every groove carried a memory, feasts after campaigns, gatherings during harvest, solemn councils when his lord's messenger had ridden in bearing orders sealed with wax. He could remember the clatter of goblets, the weight of mail still on his shoulders as he ate, too weary to remove it after days in the saddle. All of it had ended not with tragedy, but with neglect, the slow fading that erases things more thoroughly than fire ever could. Outside, the land was quiet. Once the manor had managed a few acres of barley and rye, a small orchard, and a herd of swine. The surrounding peasants had owed him labour and rent. Their cottages dotted the nearby slope, but the population had dwindled since the plague, and those who remained no longer answered to him. The distant clatter of a mill wheel now belonged to the village council. Feudal dues had given way to coin payments. Authority had slipped from his grasp like water through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but title and memory. He found himself walking the perimeter of his hall each day, tracing the same slow circuit from door to dais, from hearth to window, as if patrolling some invisible boundary. The tapestries that had once warmed the walls were gone, sold long ago to pay debts or gifted in goodwill to passing priests. Only the marks of their nails remained, small rusted dots in the plaster. The emptiness made sounds carry strangely. A footstep seemed to echo too long, a sigh lingered after it was made. Sometimes in the stillness, he would imagine that the hall might return to life, that the doors might open, and the voices of his household spill in, carrying laughter and orders, gossip and the smell of food. But imagination was not enough. He could not rebuild a world that had moved on without him. The idea of feasting felt distant now, almost indecent, as the country outside the manor sank into a quieter rhythm of subsistence and survival. The knight's hands, once steady in battle, trembled when he tried to repair what decay he could. The roof beams were beyond his skill. The stables, once home to proud destriers, now sheltered only dust and the occasional sparrow. He lit small fires in the side hearths to keep warm, but the vastness of the hall swallowed the heat. The smoke rose thinly and escaped through cracks where the chimney stones had shifted over the years. It was not only the building that was empty, the emptiness seeped into him as well, a slow, creeping quiet that replaced ambition and dulled memory. His daily prayers became shorter. The rituals of polishing armor, of sharpening blades, of maintaining readiness, all lost their meaning. The sword leaned against the wall, still sheathed. Even his armor, once gleaming, once the pride of his station, had begun to corrode at the edges, the metal clouded with a greenish patina where damp air had reached it. He sometimes thought of journeying to the nearby town, where markets bustled and the sound of hammers rang from new forges. There, life moved forward. Guildsmen negotiated contracts, apprentices learned trades, and foreign merchants carried spices and silks through the squares. But he never went. The world of trade and coin was alien to him. He knew how to ride, how to fight, how to serve, not how to barter. What words would he use there? What role would he play? At night, when the wind moved through the cracks, the hall seemed to breathe. The sound of it mingled with his own quiet movements, the shuffle of his boots, the creak of wood, the faint ring of a metal clasp. Sometimes he would light a candle and watch the flame quiver. It was the only moving thing in the vast space, a small proof that time was still passing. And yet, for all its emptiness, the hall still held him in a kind of solemn peace. It was not joy, not comfort, but something quieter, like acceptance. The same walls that had echoed with command and pride now offered him solitude. In their silence, he could think. He could remember. He could almost begin to understand what it meant to live without purpose, to exist without title. As the months passed, the rhythm of his life adjusted. He woke with the dawn, tended what remained of the grounds, mended what he could. In the evenings, he sat by the small side fire, reading fragments of old texts salvaged from his lord's library, the Vulgate Psalms, a worn copy of Boethius, and a few chronicles of ancient kings. He read them not for knowledge, but for companionship, for the quiet reassurance that others too had lived through endings. Outside, the land continued its slow transformation. More peasants left the countryside for towns, local markets expanded. The manor system that had governed for centuries was dissolving into something new, less personal, less bound by honor, but undeniably practical. The knight watched it happen from his empty hall, a spectator to the reshaping of his world. One evening, as he looked at the last light fading through the windows, he noticed the dust glowing golden in the air, as if illuminated by some distant fire. It reminded him of the banners that once caught the sunset before battle, rippling like flames above the ranks. The memory did not sadden him anymore. It was just an image, part of a world that had gone. He rose, stirred the ashes in the hearth, and for the first time in many months, he smiled faintly. Not in happiness, but in understanding. The emptiness around him was not his enemy. It was the shape of time passing. And somewhere in that realization, as the shadows lengthened across the hall's stone floor, he began to think of what he might do beyond these walls, of where the roads might lead, and whether a man without a lord could still find a way to live with honor. The days moved quietly now. Time, once divided by the rhythm of service, summons, campaigns, returns, had flattened into sameness. Each dawn arrived like the last, soft and grey, the mist rising from the meadows and dissolving into a pale sky. The knight, living still within the hollow echo of his old manor, found himself wrestling not with hunger or cold, but with thought. He had been a man built of duty, raised within a structure where every action held its meaning through service. Without that framework, meaning itself began to unravel. In the solitude of his hall, he began to take out the old texts again. The Chanson de Roland, worn and incomplete, told of loyalty beyond reason, of sacrifice for honor. The words had once thrilled him. He had copied lines of it as a squire, whispering the verses like a prayer before battle. But now, as he read them by the wavering light of his fire, he found them strange, beautiful, yes, but removed from the world he saw outside his window. The peasants ploughing the fields below, the merchants traveling the new trade roads, the young men choosing apprenticeships over arms. None of them lived by those ideals. And yet, they lived. Chivalry had been his compass, the invisible structure that guided his steps. It was a code that bound courage with faith, loyalty with morality. To be a knight was to live by restraint, to master the self as much as the sword. It had demanded piety, courtesy, and devotion, to God, to the lady of one's heart, and above all to the Lord one served. It was not merely about combat, but about order, a hierarchy of behavior meant to civilize the warrior. Now that order existed only in books, in songs and in memory. He tried to recall his last act that might have been called chivalric. It had been years ago, escorting a wounded comrade to safety during one of the final campaigns in the north. There had been snow, the sound of distant bells from a burned church, the sky heavy with ash. He had carried the man for miles, both of them silent, bound not by command, but by the wordless understanding that such acts defined who they were. But when he reached the next garrison, there had been no lord waiting to commend him, no priest to bless the deed. The gesture had vanished into the confusion of retreat, remembered by no one. Now in his isolation, the idea of honor seemed both fragile and immense. What was its purpose when there was no audience, no oath, no consequence? Could honor exist in solitude? The code had always depended on witness, the eyes of comrades, the judgment of superiors, the recognition of one's peers, but those eyes were gone. His deeds, like his title, had lost their context. Outside, the world's values were shifting. In the towns, men grew rich, not by bravery, but by calculation. The new order rewarded cunning, not courage, consistency, not valor. Commerce demanded trust, contracts, and written promises, not the spoken oath of fealty. His code had no place in the counting houses and guild halls of the emerging age. He walked through his lands, what little remained, and noticed how the villagers now spoke to one another differently. They spoke of prices, of fares, of trade routes. They no longer spoke of their lord. They paid taxes to the crown or the local magistrate, not to him. The bond between protector and peasant, once sacred, had thinned into something impersonal. No one knelt to pledge loyalty. No one brought gifts of bread or ale to the hall at harvest. Life had become practical, stripped of ceremony. At first he felt anger, not the bright fury of battle, but a dull ache of displacement. Then the anger faded, replaced by something gentler but heavier, confusion. The ideals that had once shaped his life, courage, piety, loyalty, humility, still seemed right, yet they no longer matched the shape of the world around him. Chivalry had become a ghost, haunting a landscape that no longer recognized it. Some evenings, he would walk to the small chapel at the edge of his land. The priest there was new, young, educated, in one of the rising universities, rather than the old monastic schools. He spoke of reason and law, of divine order, not in terms of feudal loyalty, but of universal truth. The knight listened, but the words felt distant, almost foreign. Faith had once been woven into action. To serve God was to serve one's Lord, and to fight well was to uphold divine justice. Now faith seemed abstract, detached from the rhythms of daily life. The knight prayed as he always had, kneeling before the altar, hands clasped, eyes closed. But where once he had prayed for strength, he now prayed for understanding, to know what place, if any, remained for men like him. The candles flickered, their smoke curling into the rafters, and he realized that even the church was changing. The priests no longer blessed swords before campaigns. They spoke instead of peace, of temperance, of the dangers of pride. It was as if the entire world had turned inward, seeking salvation not through action but through thought. Returning home through the fields, he noticed the changes more sharply. The villagers had begun to build new structures, granaries, mills, workshops. Wooden crosses marked new graveyards, reminders of the recent plagues. The people's clothing was simpler, more practical. Children played in the lanes without the shadow of armored riders. The knight felt both irrelevant and strangely relieved. For centuries his kind had kept peace through threat. Now peace seemed to hold itself. He began writing in a small ledger he found among his old belongings, a habit borrowed from monks. The entries were sparse at first, a few words each day, weather, harvest, the sound of rain against the shutters. But gradually, he wrote more, fragments of thought, reflections on the code that had once defined him. Without command, what is obedience? One line read. Another, the sword does not forget, even when the hand has. These writings became a kind of silent dialogue between the man he was and the man he was becoming. Through them, he began to understand that chivalry though fading as a social order, could remain as a personal one. It could be practiced quietly, in patience, in fairness, in the dignity with which one faced decline. Perhaps the truest form of honor was not in triumph, but in persistence without recognition. One night, as he sat by the small fire, the sound of rain filling the courtyard, he remembered the words once spoken to him by an old commander: "We serve because we must. The world turns whether we are watching or not." He had not understood those words then. They had seemed almost defeatist. Now they seemed like wisdom. Service, after all, did not require a master. It could be a way of existing, a manner of living rightly, even when no one noticed. And so, the knight began to live by a quieter version of his code. He still rose early, still prayed, still tended his gear, not out of duty, but out of rhythm. Each act became its own justification. He helped repair a villager's cart, shared what little grain he had during a lean harvest, mended the chapel door when a storm broke it loose. No one called him sir anymore, but they nodded when they passed him on the road. It was enough. The code, once vast and ceremonial, had distilled into something simple, an inward discipline. In the absence of banners and lords, it had become personal, stripped of glory but not of grace. And in that simplicity, he began to sense the faint outline of peace. The world outside his manor continued to move forward, unaware of his quiet reconciliation. Empires would rise, new kings would rule, new weapons would change the face of war again. But for the knight, the noise of history had receded. What remained was the slow, steady pulse of existence, breath, prayer, thought, the quiet persistence of a man learning how to live by ideals that no longer had a place, yet still mattered. And as the first frost touched the fields, and the smoke from the village hearths began to thicken in the valley below, he found himself wondering what lay beyond his small patch of land, what waited along the roads that curved toward the horizon, where his old companions might have gone, and whether the silence beyond his hall might yet hold a kind of purpose. When the snows melted and spring began to soften the land, the knight finally set out from his manor. He did not sell it, nor lock it. He simply left it as it was, the hearth cold, the hall empty, the banners folded. He took only his horse, a modest pack, and his sword, though he doubted it would be needed. The road that stretched before him was one he had once known well, a route patrolled in younger years, when he wore his lord's colours and men saluted as he passed. Now it was a stranger's path. The pulse a stranger's path. The countryside unfolded in slow, quiet motion. The fields were green again, dotted with small huts and new fences. Smoke rose from cottages where families worked the soil, not in fear of raids, but in patient rhythm with the seasons. He rode past them, the sun catching on the dull steel of his chainmail, and felt the weight of eyes on him. Once such glances carried pride or reverence, now they held uncertainty. A farmer paused mid-plough, leaning on his wooden handle. His ox snorted, shifting uneasily. The knight raised a hand in greeting, but the man only nodded stiffly before returning to his work. A child, barefoot and curious, peered from behind a fence post, eyes wide at the sight of armor that looked more relic than protection. Somewhere, a dog barked. The knight rode on without a word. He began to notice how the world had changed in subtle ways. The roads, once worn by the boots of soldiers and the hooves of patrols, were now filled with merchants' carts and pilgrims. The smell of war, of oil, sweat, and smoke had been replaced by that of grain, cheese, and the faint sweetness of new ale. In the market squares, voices rose in barter rather than command, and the people, once fearful of knights and the lords they served, now seemed to move with a quiet self-assurance, no longer looking upward for protection. In one village, he stopped at a small inn for the night. The sign above the door creaked in the wind, painted with a faded emblem of a boar. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the low hum of conversation greeted him, but when he entered, the room fell briefly silent. Travellers and townsfolk glanced up, eyes flicking over the scarred metal of his breastplate, the worn leather of his gloves, the sword at his hip. He removed his helm and bowed slightly, offering a polite word. The innkeeper hesitated, then gestured toward a corner bench. "You've come far," the man asked cautiously, as he poured ale into a wooden cup. "Far enough," the knight replied, setting a few coins on the table. The innkeeper studied them. "Old coin," he said, "but silver still." A faint smile crossed the knight's face. "Silver doesn't age as quickly as men." The man gave a small chuckle and moved away, yet the atmosphere remained uneasy, not hostile, but wary. The knight realized that his presence disrupted the ordinary rhythm of things. He was a reminder of a time most were eager to forget. Wars, taxes, feudal oaths, the long shadow of noble power. These villagers had likely lived through the tail end of those struggles, losing sons and brothers in causes they barely understood. To them, a knight was no longer a guardian. He was a symbol of burdens past. As he sat by the fire, listening to the laughter and chatter resume around him, he began to understand how deeply the world had moved on. The very qualities once celebrated, valor, strength, martial skill, now seemed almost uncouth, even dangerous. The people admired peace, commerce, and stability. They prized fairness and community more than conquest. The sword, which had once given him purpose, now made him an outsider. That night, he lay awake in the loft above the common room, listening to the crackle of the dying fire. Below, someone played a gentle tune on a lute, a melody unfamiliar to him, lighter, simpler than the old ballads of war and glory. He found himself strangely moved by it. Perhaps, he thought, the world's music had changed along with its values. In the days that followed, he continued southward, through forests that had grown dense and untended, across bridges rebuilt after old conflicts, through towns that no longer bore the scars of siege. In each place, he was a passing curiosity, not quite feared, not quite welcomed. Children whispered that he might be a ghost, a remnant of an age long gone. A few old men, leaning on canes, nodded in recognition, though he doubted they knew him personally. Once, he stopped at a crossroads where a stone shrine stood. It bore no crest or saint's symbol, only a carved inscription weathered nearly smooth. He brushed the moss away and read faintly, "For the souls who served and were forgotten." He stood there for a long while, feeling the weight of the words settle in his chest. At another stop, he met a monk walking barefoot along the road, carrying nothing but a small satchel and a wooden cross. They exchanged greetings, and the monk asked his name. "It matters little now," the knight said. "Names fade with banners." The monk smiled gently. "Then perhaps you are free, my son. The burden of oaths can be heavy." "Freedom," the knight repeated quietly, as if testing the sound. "It feels less like freedom and more like drifting." The monk nodded, his eyes kind. "Even a leaf that drifts may find the stream, but is that drifts may find the stream." They parted ways soon after, but the words lingered. That night, the knight thought long about what freedom meant. For most of his life, freedom had not been something to desire. It was chaos, the absence of duty, the space in which men became beasts. But now, freedom was all he had, and it frightened him. Days turned into weeks. The road wound through valleys where the air smelled of pine and wet earth, and through plains where the grass waved in long golden ripples. Sometimes he slept under the stars, his armor beside him, his sword wrapped in cloth. He began to feel his body change, lighter, less burdened by the stiffness of command. The constant clinking of mail, once the sound of readiness, now seemed like an echo of something that refused to die. He stopped wearing the full armor after a time. The villagers looked at him with less suspicion when he traveled in a plain cloak, the sword hidden beneath. He began to look like an ordinary wanderer, weary perhaps, but unremarkable, and for the first time, he felt invisible enough to observe without judgment. He saw peasants helping one another raise new barns, guild apprentices, learning trades, travelers from distant lands bringing goods and stories. The rhythm of this world was slow, cooperative, almost tender. It had no need for men like him, and that realization, though it stung, also brought peace. He began to see beauty in things he had once dismissed: the patience of a craftsman, the laughter of children chasing geese, the quiet pride of a farmer's harvest. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky burned orange, he stopped on a hill overlooking a broad plain. In the distance, he saw the faint ruins of an old fortress, its towers crumbled, its walls overgrown with ivy. He recognized it instantly. Once, it had been the seat of a rival lord he had fought against in his youth. Countless men had died for the stones that now housed only birds. He stood there for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the ruins. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the faint scent of earth and memory. In that moment, he understood something simple and unshakable. All empires fall, all oaths dissolve, all swords rust. What remains, the land, the people, the turning of seasons, is what endures. And with that realization, a small, almost imperceptible shift took place within him. The road ahead no longer felt aimless. He might not have a lord to serve, but he could still bear witness to the world as it changed, not as a knight of battle, but as a knight of observation, a quiet keeper of memory. He turned his horse toward the next village, the setting sun at his back. Somewhere beyond the horizon, he sensed that purpose might still be found, not in conquest, but in understanding. By the time the knight's road wound into the heartlands of England, or what had once felt like its heartlands, the country had taken on a new rhythm. The air smelled not of forge smoke or burning pitch, but of soil, sweat, and freshly turned fields. The world that had once been divided by banners and bloodlines now seemed to revolve around the plough. Villages that had once lain under the shadow of castles were now quietly thriving in their own right. Fields stretched farther than before, dotted with enclosed hedgerows that divided not only land but also the old order. The peasants, no longer serfs bound by the lord's command, were tilling their own soil, owning or leasing it through new agreements born from necessity. In many places, the great lords had sold their lands or left them unattended. The Black Death, and later the wars that drained treasuries and heirs alike, had hollowed the noble houses. What replaced them was not another lord, but something subtler: autonomy. The knight had known peasants once as subjects, laborers who bowed their heads and avoided eye contact when he passed. They had answered the call to arms when summoned, owed him taxes, and worked his fields in exchange for protection. Now, as he walked through the reformed countryside, he saw men standing upright, speaking freely, even bargaining with travelers. The old gestures of deference were fading, replaced by nods of recognition, equal, cautious, human. In one hamlet, he stopped by a smithy to have his stirrup repaired. The blacksmith, a broad man with soot-darkened hands, took the piece without hesitation, set it on his anvil, and began hammering. The sound rang sharp and rhythmic. When it was done, the knight offered coin, but the man refused more than a fair price. "No need for charity," the smith said simply. "We all work now." The words lingered. "We all work now." It was a truth as plain as it was revolutionary. The hierarchy of centuries had loosened. Where once nobility had lived from rents and tribute, and peasants had labored from dawn to dusk without ownership, now the line blurred. Some former serfs had become smallholders, others joined town guilds or worked as hired laborers, earning coin rather than owing service. The knight observed it all with a mixture of wonder and melancholy. He saw in it both the death of his world and the birth of something gentler. No longer did the sound of horses and steel mark the seasons. Instead, it was the ringing of hammers, the creak of mill wheels, the chatter of markets. In France, too, where he wandered for a time, the same transformation was underway. After centuries of conflict between kings, dukes, and foreign crowns, peace had left scars but also opportunities. Many minor nobles, unable to maintain their estates, sold off parcels of land, towns expanded, rural fairs drew merchants from afar. The knight crossed the Loire and saw vineyards spreading again where armies had once camped, peasants pruning vines with a quiet dignity that spoke of ownership, not servitude. He travelled into Germany's scattered territories, where the air was thick with the scent of pine and peat. The free cities there were thriving: Hamburg, Lübeck, Nuremberg, each a republic in miniature, ruled not by knights or kings, but by councils of merchants. In their streets, men who had never seen battle held more power than 100 mounted warriors. It was a world turning from swords to scales, from conquest to commerce. At first he thought the change was merely practical, an adaptation to peace, but over time he realized it was deeper. It was not just land that had shifted hands, but meaning itself. Honor no longer resided in bloodlines or martial deeds. It had begun to dwell in work, in skill, in community. The idea that a man's worth could be measured by what he produced, not what he conquered, was quietly taking root. He walked through open markets where cloth merchants displayed bright dyes from Italy and the Levant, where coopers shaped barrels beside bakers kneading dough. No banners, no crests, no heraldic devices, only signs of trade, the language of goods and prices. For centuries, knights had been the visible symbol of order, their armor reflecting the authority of their lords. Now that authority had melted away into something less visible but more enduring, the shared rhythm of daily labor. In the fields, women worked beside men, and children laughed as they carried baskets of flax. There was hardship, of course. The taxes were still heavy, the winters still long, but it was their hardship, chosen or at least accepted, not imposed by feudal demand. The knight saw the difference in their eyes. These were not the hollow stares of subservience. These were eyes that measured him as one might measure any stranger, curious but unawed. One afternoon he paused at the edge of a field where an old man was sowing grain by hand. The rhythm of his motion, the arc of the arm, the fall of the seed, was hypnotic. The knight watched for a time, then asked quietly, "Do you remember the wars?" The old man glanced up, wiping his brow. "Aye," he said, "and I remember the hunger after. But the land forgets faster than men do." That line stayed with him long after he walked away. The land forgets faster than men do. It was true. The fields no longer bore the scars of hooves or fires. The castles that once crowned every hill now stood empty or were being dismantled for stone. In their place rose windmills, barns and parish churches, symbols not of power but of endurance. In England, after the long shadow of the Wars of the Roses, a similar quiet transformation had unfolded. The Tudor peace had brought stability, but also enclosure. Hedges cutting through open fields, privatizing what had once been common. The knight saw this, and felt both sorrow and admiration. The peasants had traded one bondage for another kind, but this one was at least governed by their own hands, their own bargains. He passed through villages where ballads were sung not of knights and kings, but of harvests, floods, and lost loves. The very imagination of the people had turned inward, domestic. The age of the sword was giving way to the age of the spade. Sometimes in the evenings, he would sit by a stream and take out the blade he still carried. It was a fine weapon, balance perfect, edge keen. It had once been the measure of his identity. Now it gleamed only in memory's light. He would hold it across his knees and see in its reflection the fading glow of the sun, distorted and trembling. He thought of the code he had once served, of loyalty to one's lord, of defense of the weak, of the sanctity of one's word. All still noble ideals, yet the world now practiced them differently. The peasants' honesty in trade, their mutual aid in harvest, their shared rituals in church, these too were forms of honor, quiet ones, humble ones. Perhaps, he thought, better ones. As summer waned and he journeyed north again, he noticed how much lighter he felt. The silence that had haunted him in his empty hall was replaced by a different quiet, the peace of seeing life continue without him, stronger for his absence. He realized that history itself had moved beyond men like him. The age of knights had not ended in fire or rebellion, but in something gentler, in the steady, patient work of peasants who built a new world from the ruins of the old. And as he walked through their fields, hearing the rhythmic thud of flails and the soft lowing of cattle, he began to accept that he was now a guest in their age, a witness to the passing of his own. When he reached a crossroads one evening, he looked back toward the path he had come. The sun was low, turning the fields gold. In the distance a farmer lifted his hand in greeting, not in homage, not in fear, just acknowledgement. The knight raised his own hand in return, and for a brief moment it felt like a benediction. The world no longer needed protectors like him. But perhaps quietly, it had found its own way to endure, not through strength but through persistence. And with that thought, he turned toward the next village, the sound of wind in the wheat like the whisper of a prayer. Autumn came softly that year, its light thinning over the fields like pale gold drawn across the earth. The knight had been wandering for months, his steps slower now, his horse leaner. He found himself on the outskirts of a market town, not large enough to be a city, but bustling enough to hum with the rhythm of trade. The scent of tanned leather, hot iron, and spiced ale drifted through its narrow lanes. He entered through the gate at mid-morning, the sound of his boots echoing against cobblestones worn smooth by countless feet. Merchants called out the prices of their wares, cloth from Flanders, salt from Brittany, tools forged nearby. It was not a world he recognized. No banners hung from the windows, no crests marked allegiance, only painted signs, a barrel for the cooper, a hammer for the smith, a loaf for the baker. The symbols of commerce had replaced the symbols of war. He led his horse to the far edge of the square, where a blacksmith's forge glowed with steady heat. The hammer rang, the sound deep and resonant. The smith, a broad woman with arms corded from labor, was working a plowshare, turning it carefully with iron tongs. Sparks leapt in bursts of gold, fading into the grey morning air. The knight stood for a while watching the rhythm, the rise and fall, the shaping of metal into purpose. When she looked up, he spoke quietly. "I have need of your skill," he said. She nodded toward the racks of tools. "If it's a blade you want, I've few left for fighting. Steel's dear now. The iron goes mostly to farming. Plows, hoes, scythes. The wars don't pay like they used to." He smiled faintly at that. "I do not seek battle, only repair." He unfastened the straps of his cuirass, laying the dented breastplate on her table. The metal was dull, its edges greened by rust. She ran a hand over it, appraising. "Old work," she murmured. "Fine steel once. See the layering here. That's folded iron. Not many do it now. Too costly." He nodded. "It has seen better days." "So have we all," she said, and gave a dry smile. She named a price for mending, modest but more than he could easily spare. Steel, she explained, was scarce. War horses were being sold for farm labor. Even old weapons were being melted down into tools. The age of the swordsmith was giving way to the age of the plowmaker. He hesitated, running a hand over the armor. Once it had been worth more than the lives of peasants who worked the land. It had marked him as part of a class apart, a man sworn to duty and service. But now, standing in the low heat of the forge, he felt its weight differently. The armor had become a burden, a relic of a vanished order. He stayed the night in a small room above the smith's workshop. The smell of iron and ash clung to the air. Through the open window he could hear the muted hum of the marketplace below, traders settling accounts, children laughing, the shuffle of animals being led home. It was a peaceful sound, one that spoke of ordinary life continuing without fear. On the table beside his bed lay the rest of his gear, the gauntlets, the greaves, the sword. Each piece held memory. He could still recall the feel of them in battle, the weight balanced perfectly across his body, the ringing clash of steel upon steel, the heat inside the helm as breath fogged against metal. They had once been his second skin. Now they were cold, lifeless objects. He thought of selling them. The idea filled him with a quiet dread. To sell the armor would be to admit the end of his station, to shed not just protection but identity, and yet keeping it was folly. It drained what little money he had. Maintenance cost coin. Even the simplest repair required oil, leather, polish. Armor was made for war, not for walking forgotten roads. The next morning he returned to the forge. The blacksmith had finished repairing the breastplate. A fine job, the dents pressed smooth, the rust stripped away. She placed it before him on the workbench. "It'll last a bit longer," she said, "but the metal's tired, same as the rest of us." He looked at it in silence. The surface gleamed faintly in the grey light, not the bright sheen it once bore, but a muted luster, like a memory of pride. He touched it, feeling its chill. "How much would you pay for it?" he asked quietly. "If I were to sell?" The woman studied him for a moment, sensing the gravity of his words. Then she named a fair price, less than what it was worth to him, but more than he had expected. He nodded slowly. "Take it then." She hesitated. "Are you sure? A knight without armor, it's like a miller without a wheel." He smiled faintly. "Then perhaps I am something else now." The exchange was wordless after that. She set the armor aside carefully, as though handling something sacred. He watched as she carried it toward the back of the forge, where old weapons and tools lay waiting to be melted down. For a long time, he could not bring himself to leave. That afternoon he walked through the market again, feeling strangely light without the armor's weight. The people around him no longer looked at him as an oddity. Dressed in plain wool and leather, he blended easily into the flow of townsfolk. For the first time in years he was anonymous, neither feared nor revered, simply present. He used the coin from the sale to buy modest provisions, bread, cheese, a coarse cloak for winter. With what remained, he purchased a small iron knife, the first blade he had ever owned that was not meant for killing. That night, he camped beyond the town walls, beside a stream that caught the reflection of the stars. He laid the sword beside him, still wrapped in its cloth. The armor was gone, but he could still feel its ghost, the memory of its pressure on his shoulders, the echo of the clinking straps. He reached for the knife instead, turning it in his hand. It was simple, unadorned, sharp. It would serve him better now. As he sat by the fire, he thought of the blacksmith's forge, of how the same steel that once shaped armor was now reforged into plowshares, scythes, and hinges. The metal had not lost its strength. It had simply found new purpose. Perhaps he could do the same. He thought too of what that transformation meant, the melting down of war into peace, of nobility into usefulness. The armor that once stood between life and death would now till the soil, open furrows, grow food. It was humbling, and in its way, redemptive. For the first time in a long while, the knight slept deeply. His dreams were not of battles, but of quiet fields, of sunlight on ripening grain, of a world that no longer needed armor at all. When morning came, he woke with the decision made. The sword would be next. The road stretched before him like a ribbon of dust and promise, winding through meadows and over low hills, toward a shrine said to grant peace to the restless soul. After parting ways with his armor, and leaving behind the market town, the knight found himself drawn not to another lord's hall, nor to the training yard of some mercenary band, but to the humble trail trodden by pilgrims. He first encountered them at dawn, a small group gathered near a wayside chapel, their breaths rising like mist in the cool air. Some were peasants, others merchants or widows, all bound for the same destination, a holy shrine several weeks' journey away, where relics of a saint lay in a jeweled reliquary. Their clothes were plain, patched and dust-stained. They carried staves and rosaries, and each wore the pilgrim's badge, a simple scallop shell or tin cross pinned to cloak or hat. When he approached, they eyed him warily. The weight of his sword at his side marked him still as a man apart, neither noble nor peasant, neither priest nor merchant. But his bearing was calm, his manner humble. He bowed slightly to the eldest among them, a grey-bearded man leaning on a carved staff. "I seek company upon the road," the knight said softly. "If your band will have me." The elder studied him a moment, then nodded. "If you walk in peace, you may walk with us." So began the next chapter of his life, not as a warrior or a retainer, but as a pilgrim among the ordinary faithful. Their days followed a rhythm as old as the land itself. They rose at dawn, washed their faces in the dew, and began to walk. The road wound through forests, over rivers, crossed by creaking wooden bridges, and into villages where the smell of baking bread greeted them like blessing. Each day they covered 10 to 12 miles, sometimes less if the weather turned foul. The knight soon learned the pilgrim's patience, the slow, steady pace that quiets the mind. At first his thoughts still churned with the noise of past battles, with echoes of commands shouted across fields, with the clang of steel, but the steady sound of footsteps and the murmur of prayer began to soften those memories, sanding their edges smooth. When they stopped to rest, he would help gather wood or carry water. His hands, once trained for sword and shield, grew accustomed to simpler labors. In the evenings they would share a meal by the roadside, or sleep in the open beneath the stars. The pilgrim's life was austere, but it carried a kind of freedom he had never known, a release from oaths, from ambition, from the endless hierarchy of feudal life. At inns along the way, he sometimes felt the gaze of suspicion from innkeepers who remembered the wars, who saw in his eyes the trace of a man trained to kill. But when he offered payment and shared his bread with others, suspicion turned to nods of quiet respect. The road itself was a teacher. He watched the seasons shift, the wheat ripening, the rivers thinning, the geese flying south in careful formation. He saw how peasants bent to their work without complaint, how mothers hushed their children in the twilight, how even beggars found moments of laughter. There was grace in this endurance, a quiet dignity that no title or banner could bestow. Sometimes as they walked, he would fall into conversation with fellow travelers. One, a tanner's son from Rouen, spoke of losing his family to plague and walking the road to seek forgiveness for surviving. Another, a woman from Flanders, had taken the vow of pilgrimage after her husband's death in a mill fire. She spoke little, but her eyes carried a strength deeper than any armor. The knight rarely spoke of himself. When asked, he only said, "I once served, and now I walk." The road became his chapel. He prayed not in words but in silence, in the rhythm of his steps, in the slow breath of dawn, in the crackling of fire at night. His sword still sheathed, hung at his side, though he had not drawn it since leaving the forge. Once a bandit had trailed them for a day, but seeing the group's poverty, turned away. The knight's hand had hovered near the hilt only once, and even then his heart had not stirred with anger, only with an old instinct fading like a dream. Weeks passed, and the shrine drew nearer. The pilgrims spoke of miracles, of the lame walking, of the blind regaining sight, of burdens lifted at the saint's tomb. He did not expect miracles. What he sought was something quieter, the stillness of acceptance. As they entered the foothills where the shrine stood, the air grew thinner and purer. The sound of bells drifted on the wind. Pilgrims ahead of them sang hymns, their voices trembling with exhaustion and joy. When at last they reached the shrine, a modest chapel of stone and stained glass nestled against a ridge, the knight stood at the threshold for a long time before entering. Inside, candles flickered along the altar, their light shimmering on the relics displayed beneath glass. The pilgrims knelt, whispering prayers. Some wept. He removed his sword and laid it on the steps before the altar. The blade caught the candlelight, a faint glimmer of the life he had once lived. For years it had been his companion, his symbol, his purpose. Now, it was only a piece of iron. He did not weep. Instead, he bowed his head and whispered, "May it be enough." Hours later, when he rose to leave, he did not reclaim the sword. The priest at the shrine, an old man with eyes like weathered stone, touched his arm gently. "Few leave such burdens behind," the priest said. "It takes courage to lay down what once defined you." The knight smiled faintly. "Perhaps it takes weariness more than courage." The priest nodded. Wariness is its own kind of wisdom. Outside, as the sun set, the knight stood with the other pilgrims. They shared a final meal together, bread, dried apples and wine thin as water. They sang a simple hymn of thanks, their voices carrying across the valley like wind through grass. When morning came, the group began to disperse, some returning home, others pressing on to other shrines. The knight lingered a while longer. For the first time in his life he had no destination, no order, no command to follow. The road stretched endlessly ahead, open and uncertain. He turned from the shrine and began walking once more, his hands empty, his back light. The sound of the bells faded behind him, replaced by the whisper of wind and the call of distant birds. He walked not as a knight, nor as a penitent, but as something new, a man at peace with the road. The pilgrim's road, once open and uncertain, eventually brought him back into the changing heart of Europe, a land reshaped not by conquest, but by quiet, relentless transformation. The age of his kind had waned, and though he had long felt its fading in his bones, now he could see it made plain in the landscape itself. The world had grown smaller, not in its breadth of land, but in its spirit. Where once there had been wild frontiers, moated castles, and the proud isolation of estates, there now stretched enclosed fields and market towns, threaded together by roads of commerce. The boundaries of power no longer ran along the edges of forests or the ramparts of keeps, but along routes of trade, invisible yet binding, drawn in parchment and sealed with wax. He walked through regions that had once bristled with fortresses, the grey remnants of a feudal order. Here, a tower overgrown with ivy leaned precariously beside a stream, its banners long since torn away. There, a motte that had once bristled with spears stood silent, sheep grazing upon its slopes. The castles that remained intact no longer housed lords of war, but petty administrators, royal tax collectors, or minor clergy, who maintained them as regional outposts of authority. The knight would sometimes stop to study these ruins, running a hand along the weathered stones. The mortar crumbled easily beneath his fingers. Each stone felt like a relic from a life now irretrievably past, a world where loyalty had been measured in service and sword, not in silver. It was strange, he thought, that the end of war did not bring peace, only a different kind of struggle. The peasants he met on the road no longer feared the raids of barons or the burning of crops, but they spoke bitterly of taxes levied by distant kings, of grain prices dictated by merchants in towns they had never seen. Power had not disappeared, it had simply changed its shape, from mailed fists to ledgers, from heraldry to coinage. When he reached a small walled town one autumn evening, he paused before its gatehouse. The sentry who questioned him wore not armor of chain or plate, but a quilted jack dyed the color of mud, and bore a halberd in place of a sword. He was a city guard, not a knight, a servant of civic order, not chivalric law. Inside the walls, the narrow streets were crowded with stalls and chatter. Merchants from distant coasts bartered in a dozen tongues. Cloth from Flanders, salt from the Baltic, and spices from Italy filled the air with scents both foreign and familiar. The knight moved slowly through the throng, feeling both fascination and alienation. Here, honor was measured not in valor but in balance sheets. Men rose and fell, not through bloodlines or oaths, but through trade and coin. Guilds replaced feudal courts, ledgers replaced oaths. And yet, beneath the bustle, he sensed the same human desires, for stability, for meaning, for belonging. The forms had changed, but the needs remained. He found lodging in a small inn near the market square. The innkeeper, a stout woman with shrewd eyes, asked no questions beyond the coin he offered. At supper, he shared a bench with two merchants discussing shipping routes along the Rhine. They spoke of new laws, of royal charters and tariffs, of towns forming leagues for mutual protection. It was a different kind of alliance, one built not on swords and castles, but on contracts and coins. The knight listened quietly, his rough hands folded on the table, when one merchant turned to him and asked, half in jest, if he was some kind of soldier. He only smiled faintly. "I was," he said, "long ago." The merchant laughed lightly. "Then you've seen enough of fighting. These days, the wars are fought with numbers and ink." The knight nodded, though the words unsettled him more than he expected. Numbers and ink. It was a bloodless warfare, yet it conquered all the same. That night, he walked outside the town's walls. From the hilltop he could see the glow of hearth fires spreading across the valley, cottages and farms stretching farther than they once had, signs of a land tamed and parcelled. The wild edges of the medieval world were shrinking, fenced off and catalogued. Even the forests seemed smaller, their mysteries fading beneath the axe and plough. He thought of his old comrades, those who had survived, and those who had not. Some had entered royal service as guards or bailiffs. Others had taken to mercenary bands, fighting in petty disputes between cities or dukes. Many, he imagined, had perished, not in glorious battle, but in obscurity, buried in foreign soil under names forgotten. He was among the lucky ones, he supposed. He had survived long enough to see peace, though peace came with its own loneliness. There was no place now for a knight without a master. The great chain of feudal allegiance, that delicate web of mutual obligation, had rusted away. In its place stood bureaucracy, money, and an emerging sense of order that asked for no oaths and granted no honor. He began to understand that he no longer inhabited the same kind of world he had been born into. It was not simply that his lord had died, or that wars had ceased. It was that the language of his world, of fealty, valor, devotion, had lost its meaning. The people he met did not speak of chivalry or lineage. They spoke of trade fairs, of rents, of coinage reforms, of tolls on bridges. Still, he could not resent them. Their lives were modest, but they were stable in ways his had never been. A man who could work his field or ply his craft no longer needed a lord's protection. The peasants he had once defended with his sword now defended themselves with laws and markets. The social order that had once seemed eternal had melted quietly away. On one of his wanderings beyond the town, he came across an abandoned keep by the river, its drawbridge rotted, its towers half collapsed. Grass grew through the cracks of the courtyard. He entered, and stood where the great hall must once have been. The fireplace was cold, the walls crumbling, the silence heavy. In the dust, he saw the faint outlines of what might have been a crest, faded paint on stone, perhaps a griffin, or a cross. He wondered who had last feasted here, what voices had once filled this space. Then gently, he knelt and brushed away a layer of moss, as if uncovering the last memory of a vanished order. He stayed there until the evening light turned the walls golden, then grey. When he finally turned away, it was with a quiet understanding that the world did not end. It only changed, piece by piece, until one day a man looked around and no longer recognized it. The knight descended the hill, his steps slow, steady, and unhurried. The sound of a distant bell marked the hour, not a war drum, but a town's curfew bell calling its citizens to rest. The age of banners and battle horns had given way to the age of bells and markets. He did not feel bitterness, only distance, as though the world had folded in on itself, leaving him at its edge. And yet, even as he walked into the twilight, a quiet thought persisted. Perhaps every age leaves some behind. He found them by chance, as he had come to find most things in this later stretch of life, not by seeking, but by wandering. It was late autumn, when the leaves turned the color of rust, and the wind carried the scent of wood smoke across the fields. The knight had been following a trade road that wound through forest and moor, the kind of path merchants now favored over the old feudal tracks that once led from castle to castle. At dusk he came upon a clearing by the edge of the woods, where the faint glow of a fire trembled against the dark. He hesitated at first, cautious of bandits who sometimes haunted such places, but then a voice called softly through the shadows. "Traveller," it said, slow and even, "come share the warmth. We've no quarrel with honest men." He stepped forward, the firelight revealing 3 figures seated around the embers. They looked up as he approached, and for a long moment none of them spoke. Then one of the men, grey-bearded, heavy-shouldered, with the bearing of one who had once worn armor, gave a low chuckle. "I know that stance," the man said. "You've carried a sword longer than a pilgrim's staff, haven't you?" The knight inclined his head, lowering his cloak. "Once," he said. The grey-bearded man gestured to a place beside the fire. "Then you'll understand our talk better than most." He sat. The fire crackled softly, throwing red light upon faces marked by years of weariness and survival. One of the men wore a rough leather jerkin patched many times over. Another, whose hair was nearly white, bore an old wound across his cheek, the scar like a pale thread. There was a familiarity about them, not in feature but in bearing, men who had lived by the sword, and who carried the silence of battle long after the noise had faded. A pot simmered over the coals, filling the air with the faint scent of onions and barley. The grey-bearded man stirred it idly with a stick. "We were knights once," he said almost absently, "served a count in Burgundy, before the wars thinned us out. These days we guard caravans or dig ditches. One of us even tried monastery life for a year." The white-haired one gave a small laugh. "Didn't take," he said. "Turns out, I've no patience for bells or silence." The abbot said, "I prayed like a man waiting for battle." The others smiled faintly, but there was no mockery in it, only a shared melancholy, the gentle humor of men who had seen too much to pretend. The knight introduced himself simply. He spoke little of his past, but when they learned he too had once ridden under a noble banner, the conversation deepened. They spoke not as warriors boasting of deeds, but as survivors recounting a vanished age. They told of campaigns fought in lands that no longer remembered their names, of sieges where lords promised glory and left them unpaid, of winter marches when frost clung to the edges of their mail. Each story began brightly, with the echo of trumpets, the weight of oaths, but each ended the same way, in silence, with a shrug or a weary sigh. "Our lord died of fever," one said, staring into the fire. "No heir. The lands went to the crown. His men scattered. I sold my armor to buy a mule." Another, tracing the scar along his cheek, murmured, "Mine died at Agincourt. I was left behind with the wounded. Never took another master after that." The knight listened, and found his own thoughts reflected in theirs. The details differed, but the story was the same. Men trained for a world that no longer existed. Men who had lived by vows now rendered obsolete. Around the fire they were equals again, not by title or wealth, but by shared loss. For a while they spoke of the changes overtaking the world, of towns rising where castles once stood, of mercenary companies that fought for coin instead of cause, of kings who ruled not through fealty, but through written law. "Honor," the grey-bearded man said, stirring the pot again, "used to mean something you could feel in your chest. Now it's a word they print in proclamations." The knight nodded slowly. "And yet the world seems calmer for it." "Perhaps," the man said. "But I wonder if calmness is only another word for forgetting." The fire hissed as a log split, sending up a brief shower of sparks. Above them, the stars shone with cold precision, untroubled by the passing of ages. They ate their stew in silence. The taste was plain, but it filled them, warmed their bellies against the chill. One of the men produced a flask of weak wine, passing it around. When it reached the knight, he drank sparingly and handed it back. Later, as the night deepened, the talk turned softer, not of battles, but of memory. They spoke of the sound of armor being buckled before dawn, of the rhythm of horses' hooves on frozen ground, of banners snapping in the wind. They remembered the faces of men long dead, the smell of campfires on the eve of battle, the solemn prayers whispered before the charge. It was not nostalgia, exactly, more like a slow reckoning with time. Each memory seemed to belong less to them, and more to history itself, as though they were merely caretakers of something that had already slipped away. Before sleep, the knight looked around the fire and thought how strange it was that they had all ended up here, once bound by lords and banners, now bound only by the shared silence of displacement. He lay down beneath his cloak, the earth cool against his back. Above, the constellations wheeled slowly through the darkness, the same stars that had guided them on night marches, that had watched over battlefields now forgotten. He wondered if they, too, remembered. At dawn, mist hung low over the clearing. The men rose one by one, stretching stiff limbs. They shared a few final words. No promises, no farewells, only nods of understanding. Each had his own road to follow, his own way of living with what remained. When the knight set off again, he did not look back. The road ahead felt emptier now, but also lighter. In the distance, a bell tolled faintly from some unseen village, a sound both familiar and distant. He walked toward it, the echo of the fire still lingering in his thoughts, the memory of men who once carried steel and now carried silence. The world no longer called them knights, but something of that name remained, not in rank or recognition, but in endurance. They had survived the end of their age, which, in its quiet way, was another kind of victory. The knight walked on until the forest thinned, and the land opened again into gentle fields and quiet lanes. The morning light spread across the horizon, soft and pale, revealing villages where life moved at its unhurried rhythm. Somewhere beyond, the world continued to turn. Merchants traded, kings decreed, peasants harvested, but the old bonds, the banners, the feasts and the vows had dissolved like breath in cold air. And yet, beneath that silence, something human persisted, the shared understanding among those few who remembered what it meant to serve, and to lose, and to keep walking nonetheless. The years that followed were neither noble nor cruel, merely necessary. The knight, once defined by his vows and lineage, slipped quietly into a new role that demanded neither. In an age when oaths had lost their weight, and kings ruled from distant capitals, a man's skill with a sword still held value, even if its purpose had changed. He became, as so many of his kind did, a soldier of fortune, one more blade in a Europe teeming with them. Italy, Burgundy, and the German states offered endless work for men who could ride, march, and kill with discipline. The mercenary companies, condottieri in Italy, landsknechts in the empire, had turned warfare itself into a trade. It was no longer about loyalty or divine right, it was about survival and profit. His first contract came through a broker in a tavern near Cologne, a man who called himself Albrecht and claimed to serve several lords, though likely served only his purse. The knight signed his name with a trembling hand, realizing it was the first time he had written it, not in service to a lord or cause but to himself. He was given a horse, a rough coat of plates, and half his pay in advance, a small pouch of florins, heavy in the palm, and strangely impersonal. The contract bound him for 6 months, to a merchant consortium defending its caravans against raiders. When it ended, he moved on to another, guarding a city gate in Lombardy, escorting envoys across mountain passes, fighting in petty feuds between nobles who could no longer afford standing armies. At first, the work felt like betrayal. To draw a blade, not for one's lord, but for the highest bidder, was to abandon everything that had once defined him. Yet, as weeks turned to months, the unease dulled. The new world did not care for purity of purpose. It rewarded efficiency, and he had always been efficient. The mercenary camps were strange echoes of the armies he had once known. Instead of banners bearing crests of noble houses, they flew emblems of companies, painted hands, griffins, daggers, the crude marks of captains who commanded by contract rather than birth. The men beneath them were a restless mix, veterans of forgotten wars, disinherited sons, runaway serfs, and foreign adventurers, who spoke a dozen dialects but shared the same hunger. In the evenings, the camps buzzed with the sound of dice and drinking. Fights broke out easily, settled with knives or fists, and forgotten by dawn. Loyalty was fluid, not to any man, but to pay and rations. Still, among the older fighters, a kind of grim professionalism persisted. They maintained their weapons carefully, drilled with precision, and respected those who did the same. The knight earned that respect not through boasting but through silence. He fought as he had always fought, efficiently, without cruelty. When others grew drunk on blood or victory, he remained calm, his strikes deliberate. It was said among the younger men that he had once been a knight of some great house, though no one knew which. He never corrected them. The truth no longer mattered. Years blurred into campaigns. Sometimes he fought for city-states defending their independence, sometimes for dukes expanding theirs. He crossed the Alps twice, marched through fields burned and fields in bloom, and saw men die for causes none of them understood. The flags changed, the languages shifted, but the work was always the same. The clash of steel, the smell of earth and sweat and fear. There was money, though never enough. It came in uneven intervals, counted by clerks who had never seen battle. When it did, he spent little, a meal, a cloak, a book sometimes. The rest he hid, though he no longer knew what he was saving for. As the years passed, he saw comrades fall not only to swords but to sickness, hunger, and despair. A few found religion, trading the soldier's tent for the monk's cell. Others turned to banditry when contracts dried up. The lucky ones found work as guards or captains of small garrisons, settling into lives of quiet obscurity. The knight carried on, moving from war to war like a drifting leaf. He no longer asked who was right or wrong. He measured time in campaigns, and the passing of seasons in the way the armor rusted quicker in the damp, or how the winter sun fell differently on the plains of Lombardy than on the forests of France. But in rare moments when battle ended and the air stilled, he would feel the hollow echo of what he had lost. Once war had meant purpose, an oath fulfilled, a banner followed. Now it was merely a means to see another sunrise. One winter, his company took service under a condottiere named Federico da Montevolo, a man as pragmatic as he was ruthless. Federico paid on time, fed his men well, and cared little for anything beyond efficiency. Fight clean, he would say. Don't waste motion, don't waste breath, and never die for a fool's cause. The knight understood him better than he wished to. That campaign was against a rival city-state, a conflict of tariffs and insults dressed up as honor. They besieged a walled town for 3 weeks before the gates opened, not from valor or defeat, but from negotiation. The citizens paid the ransom, the armies dispersed, and both sides declared victory. It was war reduced to arithmetic. In the aftermath, as he walked the quiet streets littered with discarded arrows, the knight realized something that had long been forming in his mind. The world had found a way to keep war without needing warriors. Mercenaries replaced knights, contracts replaced fealty, and pay replaced glory. The age of chivalry had not ended. It had been absorbed, rewritten in ink and coin. Still there were nights when he sat by the campfire, oiling his sword, and felt the faint tug of old instincts. He would think of his first lord, the way the man had spoken of duty, of service as sacred. The words felt almost foreign now, like a prayer in a forgotten language. Once after a skirmish he found a wounded young soldier lying in the mud, clutching a broken spear. The boy's eyes were wide with fear. The knight knelt, pressed a hand to his shoulder, and said quietly, "You can rest." He did not know why he said it. Perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of mercy. When the boy exhaled for the last time, something in the knight's chest tightened, not with grief, but with memory. He remembered the man he had been, and the world that had needed such men. When spring came, he left Federico's company without ceremony. No one stopped him. No one asked why. The road had grown familiar again, an old companion waiting for his return. He walked without direction, carrying the same sword that had passed through countless hands, and yet feeling that it belonged to none. The world around him was still busy with its making, merchants, towns, and kings, all weaving new systems of power. But he who had once been part of those foundations, now moved through it like a shadow. And in that shadow, he began to feel something unexpected, a strange, weary kind of freedom. He had no banner, no master, no cause, only time, and the faint memory of what it once meant to serve. The final battle he fought was not remarkable. No grand banners tore in the wind. No heroic charge shattered an enemy line. It was a skirmish, a brief, chaotic clash in the borderlands between two minor lords whose names no chronicler would remember. The field was narrow, hemmed by thickets and frost-hardened soil. The fighting ended as it often did, in confusion, exhaustion, and the thin sound of retreating hooves. When it was over, the knight stood still among the dead. The smell of smoke and iron clung to the air. A broken shield lay half buried in the mud, painted with an emblem he did not recognize, a blue serpent coiled around a sun. He could not tell whether it belonged to friend or foe. It did not seem to matter. The men around him were younger now. They fought for pay and plunder, for the noise of battle itself. He had once been like them, eager, quick, sure of purpose. But standing there, the weight of his sword hanging heavy at his side, he felt only fatigue, vast and colourless. The sounds of the world, wind in the grass, the faint groan of a dying horse, reached him more clearly than any command or cry. That night, when the fires were lit and the survivors gathered for drink, he did not join them. He cleaned his blade with slow, deliberate motions, then stared at it in the firelight. The edge was nicked, the hilt worn smooth from years of grip. It was a good weapon, one that had outlasted masters, lords, and causes. He realized, suddenly and quietly, that it had outlasted his need for it. At dawn, before the camp awoke, he walked to the edge of a nearby wood. The frost shimmered pale on the leaves, and the breath of the earth rose in thin mist. There, beneath an oak older than memory, he knelt. He placed the sword on the ground, carefully, reverently. He did not say a prayer, for the gods of war had long ceased to answer him. Instead, he took a spade from a soldier's kit, dug a narrow trench, and laid the blade within. The soil was cold against his hands. When he covered it, he pressed the earth flat, as though sealing a grave. He stood for a long while afterward, watching the light shift through the branches. In that quiet, something loosened inside him, not joy, not sorrow, but release. The sword, buried deep, seemed to take with it the noise of battle, the clang of iron, and the shouting of men. The silence that followed was strange at first, then soothing. He did not return to the camp. He simply turned west, walking without destination, the forest swallowing him in muted green. The land he wandered through was vast and still. Winter began to soften at its edges. Thawed streams murmured through the meadows. The roads, once busy with soldiers and merchants, were quiet now. Only the distant creak of wagon wheels, the bark of a dog, or the rhythm of his own steps breaking the calm. In some villages, people recognized him for what he was, or had been. They saw it in his posture, the scars, the way he moved as if expecting orders that never came. They offered him bread or water, and he accepted with a nod, speaking little. He had no coin to offer, but sometimes he repaired fences, lifted stones, or helped in the fields. His hands, used to the weight of weapons, found strange peace in labor. He began to understand the rhythm of soil and season, how a field must rest before it bears again, how silence could heal the ground the way it healed men. In one such hamlet, he stayed for a time. He slept in a barn, mended roofs, and fetched water for the villagers. When asked his name, he gave none. He was simply the knight, though the title had become a relic, like an old word whose meaning had been forgotten. Nights came quietly. The villagers slept early, their candles dim behind shuttered windows. He would sit outside, watching the stars fade one by one as the mist rolled in from the fields. Sometimes he thought of the wars, not of their horror, but of their sound, the clash, the shouting, the drum beats. They had filled the world so completely that silence now felt like a vast emptiness. Yet within that emptiness, he began to hear other things, the lowing of cattle, the creak of trees, the whisper of his own breath. Months passed. His hair grew long, streaked with grey. His hands hardened again, this time from labor instead of war. The people in the village stopped asking questions. He was useful, quiet, and kind, enough to earn a place among them, though not a history. In spring he returned to the oak where he had buried his sword. The leaves had thickened, casting dappled light across the clearing. He knelt again, brushing the soil with his fingers. He could still feel where the earth had been disturbed, but he did not dig. Some things, he understood now, were meant to stay buried. He sat there until dusk, the light turning gold, and then blue. A bird sang somewhere above him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel weary in a way that was not despair. It was the weariness of being human again, of having no purpose beyond the day's work and the quiet that followed. When he finally rose, he did not look back. The forest path stretched ahead, winding through alder and ash. He followed it slowly, his footsteps soundless on the soft ground. The air smelled faintly of rain, and as the first drops began to fall, he felt, though he could not name it, a kind of peace. The silence of the oak, the rhythm of the rain, the absence of command, it was all one, a steady hush in which life could begin again, unremarked and unremembered. In that hush, he ceased to be a knight at all. He became only a man, moving quietly through a land that no longer needed saving. The road led him, almost without intention, to a valley where a river wound lazily through meadows and low woods. The land was neither rich nor poor, neither wild nor tamed, simply quiet, as though forgotten by the wars that had scarred the rest of the world. At its center lay a small village, no more than a dozen cottages with thatched roofs sagging under years of weather. Smoke rose from low chimneys, carrying the smell of peat and bread. He arrived one afternoon in late autumn. The air was damp, the fields pale with stubble, where grain had been harvested weeks before. A few villagers paused their work to watch him approach, wary at first, for in those times, a lone traveller still carried the weight of suspicion. Yet his armour was gone, his clothes worn but clean, his stride measured. He looked less like a warrior, and more like a tired pilgrim who had lost his way. He asked for no shelter, only a place to rest. An old widow who lived near the church offered him a corner of her barn, and he accepted. In return, he repaired the door that hung loose on its hinges and split enough wood to last her through the first frost. She thanked him quietly, and word spread among the villagers that the stranger was useful, strong, silent, and seemingly harmless. Winter came early that year, the river crusted with thin ice, and smoke thickened over the roofs. He stayed, finding small ways to make himself needed. When a fence collapsed under snow, he mended it. When wolves began to prowl near the sheepfolds, he took a spear and drove them off, though he never struck to kill. He knew too well the taste of bloodshed, and saw no honor in adding to it now. Days lengthened into a rhythm of work and quiet. At dawn he helped the herdsmen drive their flocks to pasture. At dusk he gathered wood and mended tools by firelight. The villagers grew accustomed to his presence, not as a guest, but as something like a fixture, as steady and unremarkable as the stones in the field walls. He seldom spoke of himself. When asked where he had come from, he would only say, "Far enough." His hands told their own story. Scarred, calloused, but deft. The children, less cautious than their elders, sometimes followed him as he worked, fascinated by his precision. One boy, a shepherd's son with quick eyes, often lingered nearby, watching the way the knight handled a blade as if it were a living thing. One evening, as they sat by the sheepfold sharpening tools, the boy asked how he learned to do it so well. The knight hesitated. It had been many years since anyone had asked him to teach, and longer still since he had thought of his skill as worth passing on. He showed the boy how to angle the stone, how to feel for the right rhythm, not too fast, not too slow. "The steel listens," he said quietly. "You don't force it, you let it remember what it's meant to be." The boy nodded, watching the sparks dance in the dim light. It was a simple exchange, but it stirred something in the night, the faint memory of discipline, of craft, of purpose gentled by patience rather than violence. spring returned, slow and green. The river thawed, swelling with meltwater from the hills. He began to walk its banks in the early mornings, listening to the soft hiss of current against stone. The rhythm of the water reminded him of breathing, steady, indifferent, eternal. Sometimes he thought of his buried sword, now deep beneath moss and root, and felt no regret. He realized with quiet astonishment that he no longer missed it. The village, too, seemed to breathe differently with the turning of the season. Fields were sown, roofs patched, animals birthed. There was work enough for everyone, and for the first time in his life, he found comfort in work that built instead of destroyed. When storms broke over the valley, he would help the men tie down thatch or dig trenches to guide the water away from homes. The labor bound him to the land in ways war never had. The shared effort of survival, unmarked by victory or defeat. Though he never sought it, respect grew around him, not the loud, ceremonial kind that had once accompanied his title, but a quieter form, trust, gratitude, familiarity. The widow still left food for him at her door. The shepherd boy brought him questions about knives and traps. Even the village priest, a thin, mild man who kept to himself, sometimes nodded to him when they crossed paths at dawn. In these small gestures, he began to understand something that had eluded him all his life. Peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of continuity, the slow, steady pulse of things persisting, season to season, regardless of who ruled or who fought. One afternoon, as he worked repairing a mill wheel by the river, he looked up to see the reflection of the clouds drifting across the water. The air smelled of wet wood and barley. The sound of the turning wheel, slow, rhythmic, inevitable, filled his ears. It was the same sound, he realized, that had filled these valleys long before him and would continue long after. For the first time, he did not feel apart from it. He was not a relic moving through a world that had outgrown him, as he once believed. He was part of its stillness, part of its slow labor. The night within him, the oaths, the armor, the restless pride, had become something smaller, quieter, almost transparent. There were nights when he would sit outside his hut, the stars low and bright, and think of all the men he had known, comrades, lords, enemies. He wondered if any had found such peace, or if they still wandered, seeking wars that no longer mattered. He did not pity them. He simply hoped they would one day find a place like this, where the only sounds were wind and water, and where the hands could heal what they once destroyed. Years might have passed, or merely months. Time no longer seemed to move in measures he could name. He lived between seasons, between dawn and dusk, carrying no banner, obeying no command. In the stillness of that village by the river, he discovered something gentler than honor, deeper than obedience, endurance without struggle, purpose without pride. And as the fields ripened once more under the long light of summer, the villagers scarcely remembered the day he first arrived. He had become part of the place, a presence as natural as the river's murmur, as quiet as the turning of the mill wheel. The years did not arrive with ceremony. They came softly, like mist over the fields at dawn, each one nearly indistinguishable from the last, yet each carrying its own subtle change. Time no longer struck him as a thing to measure by wars or rulers, but by the tilt of light through the window of his small hut, or by the sound of the church bell drifting over the river in the evening. His life settled into a rhythm that was neither hurried nor aimless. At dawn he would wake to the faint scent of smoke from the hearths across the village, each chimney releasing its thin ribbon of grey into the pale air. The bells from the chapel tolled softly, not as summons but as a kind of heartbeat, marking the day's slow unfolding. He began to move through the world as though it were a series of recurring gestures, the mending of tools, the gathering of kindling, the walk to the river to check the waters rise. In spring he helped guide the oxen through the wet furrows. In summer he joined the reapers in the fields, cutting grain with slow precision. His hands, once suited to holding steel, now turned soil and lifted stones. The villagers had long ceased to treat him as an outsider. To the young he was simply there, as constant as the river, as weathered as the fence posts. Children ran past him without hesitation. Dogs followed him down the road. He did not seek friendship, yet found himself woven quietly into their lives, a helper when needed, a listener when words ran dry. It was in these unspoken exchanges that he discovered the kind of belonging he had never known in the courts or battlefields of his youth. There he had lived by command and recognition. Here he lived by rhythm and return. The seasons shaped him as much as they shaped the land. In spring the world awoke with a kind of cautious hope. Buds formed along the hedges, and the fields grew soft underfoot. He would walk through them at dawn, his breath misting in the chill, watching the crows lift slowly from the plough lines. There was work everywhere, sowing, mending, patching roofs torn by winter winds. The air was full of sound again, but it was not the noise of war. It was the sound of renewal, patient and unhurried. Summer followed in its fullness, heavy and golden. The river slowed to a glassy calm, its banks bright with wildflowers. The knight, though he no longer thought of himself by that name, spent long hours repairing the mill, or helping in the fields. In the heat, his movements grew slow, methodical, and when he rested beneath the trees, he would sometimes drift into sleep and dream of nothing. Autumn came softly, almost imperceptibly. The air cooled. The light turned amber. Harvest was a quiet celebration, not of abundance, but of endurance. The villagers gathered in the evenings to thresh grain and mend nets, their laughter low and steady, unshaken by uncertainty. He joined them rarely, content to sit nearby and listen, his heart filled with a strange warmth that came not from joy, but from the deep comfort of familiarity. Winter, as always, demanded stillness. The river froze at its edges, and frost silvered the fields. He would wake before dawn to light the hearth, the flame catching slowly on the wood he had split months before. The smoke rose in thin threads through the cold air. Outside, the village seemed to vanish beneath snow, and the only movement came from those who had no choice but to tend to their animals or fetch water. He took to carving small figures from wood during those months, not saints or soldiers, but animals, leaves, and the faces of people he half remembered. He kept them in a box by his bed, never showing them to anyone. It was not pride or secrecy, but something quieter, the sense that these small shapes were his way of keeping memory from fading entirely. The passing of years showed itself slowly upon him. His hair, once dark, had turned pale. His shoulders had stooped slightly, though he still carried himself with the bearing of discipline. When he caught his reflection in the river, he sometimes did not recognize the man looking back, not because of age alone, but because the expression was so calm. There was no regret there, no hunger for what had been, only a quiet awareness that he had survived his own time. The world he once knew, of banners, oaths, and battles, had become a story told by others, a distant legend. Children played at nights in the fields, shouting names of kings they had never seen. He watched them with gentle amusement, remembering when those games had been his truth. Yet even in stillness, the habits of vigilance remained. When storms gathered, he would brace the cottage door. When travelers passed through the village, he observed them carefully, noting their posture, their manner of walking. He no longer feared the world, but he understood it, the way danger could arrive quietly, in disguise, and still, life carried on. The river, faithful and unhurried, marked the days with its soft murmur. The bells tolled at familiar hours, dawn, noon, dusk. The same smells rose each evening: smoke, grain, damp earth. Time did not rush, it settled, layering itself like silt along the banks of his memory. He began to think of his days as seasons themselves, each one distinct, yet inseparable from the rest. The spring of his youth had long passed, the summer of his strength had burned away. Now he lived in his autumn, steady and reflective, content to watch rather than to act. The winter, he knew, would come, as it must. But there was no fear in that thought. only inevitability, like the turning of the wheel or the slow fading of light across the hills. Sometimes, in the long twilight, he would sit by the river and listen to the wind in the reeds. He would think of the countless fields he had ridden across, the countless faces that had come and gone. So many had sought to shape history through power, and so few had learned to simply endure it. He realized, with a faint smile, that perhaps endurance was the truest form of victory. And so the seasons continued, their beauty quiet, their rhythm unbroken. The knight's life, once defined by noise and motion, became an unspoken prayer to continuity itself. In time, even his memories grew soft around the edges, like parchment fading with age. The world beyond the valley carried on, kings rose and fell, wars were fought and forgotten, but here by the river, the days moved with the same gentle certainty. He was no longer a relic, nor a witness, nor a survivor. He was simply part of the landscape, folded into its slow pulse, a man at peace with the passing of all things. The path to the monastery wound gently uphill through the forest, a narrow track half claimed by roots and fallen leaves. He had walked it many times before, but never with intent, only in passing. This time, something in him sought quiet not merely of place, but of purpose. The years in the village had softened him, yes, but they had also left spaces, silent hollows within, that no labor, no season's rhythm could quite fill. When the first stone walls of the monastery appeared through the morning mist, they seemed less like a fortress and more like a memory of one. Moss crawled over the outer gate, and ivy clung to the bell tower. The air carried the faint scent of beeswax, bread and incense. Bells tolled softly in the distance, not a call to arms, but to prayer. A young monk greeted him at the gate, bowing slightly. There were no questions of rank, name or purpose, only a gentle, "You are welcome here, brother." It was the first time in many years that anyone had called him brother, and the word settled in his chest like a long-forgotten warmth. Inside, the monastery moved at a pace the world had long abandoned. Everything was deliberate, the washing of hands before meals, the folding of robes, the silence between prayers. The brothers spoke rarely, and when they did, it was with the calm precision of those who understood the weight of words. He stayed among them for several days, sleeping in the guest quarters, a narrow cell with a wooden bed, a pitcher of water, and a single candle. The austerity was not uncomfortable, it was clarifying. Here, life had been stripped of pretense. Every act, no matter how small, seemed sacred, not because it was grand, but because it was done with devotion. At dawn, he followed the monks into the chapel. The walls were bare stone, light streamed through a single high window, falling across their bowed heads like pale fire. Their chants rose and fell in low unison, not songs of triumph, but murmurs of endurance. The sound reminded him of distant battlefields, but inverted, not the roar of men seeking glory, but the quiet voices of men seeking grace. He watched them move through their day, tending gardens, illuminating manuscripts, mending old roofs, teaching children from nearby villages. There was discipline here, the kind he once knew, but without cruelty or pride. It was discipline for peace, not for conquest. He realized as he watched them that their strength came not from resistance, but from acceptance. They did not fight time, they lived within it, harmonizing with its flow. One of the older monks, a man whose eyes shone like candlelight in shadow, noticed his silence. Over the evening meal, they spoke briefly, the monk asking little, the knight saying less. Yet before he left, the monk pressed a small parchment and a quill into his hands. "You have carried much," the monk said softly. "It may lighten, if you give it shape." That night, back in his cell, he began to write. At first, only fragments, names, places, the clang of steel in rain, the cry of a dying horse. Then small reflections, the smell of wet soil after battle, the silence that followed a trumpet's call, the sight of a banner sinking into mud. He did not write for memory, nor to preserve the past. He wrote to understand it, to give meaning to what had once seemed senseless. The words came slowly, unevenly, but with each one he felt something loosen. The burden of recollection began to shift from pain to pattern, from wound to wisdom. He wrote prayers, though he had never been taught their form. Not prayers for salvation, but for comprehension, for those he had slain, for those he had failed, for the younger man he had once been. Days stretched into a quiet rhythm. He rose with the monks, walked the cloister in silence, wrote through the afternoons. His entries became gentler, less about war, more about what came after. The turning of seasons, the grace of small labors, the rare gift of peace. Sometimes he would look up from his writing and watch the brothers tending the garden. Their robes fluttered softly in the wind, their movements unhurried. He envied them, but not as he once envied kings. He envied the simplicity of their purpose. When he finally prepared to leave, the abbot met him at the gate. The old man placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your battles were not in vain," the abbot said. "They led you here. Every wound, every sorrow, each one was a step towards stillness." The knight, though he no longer thought of himself by that name, bowed his head. He did not argue. He simply accepted. As he descended the hill, the monastery bell rang behind him, its tone low and resonant, echoing through the valley. It did not sound like farewell, but benediction. Back in his small home by the river, he continued to write, not daily, not obsessively, but with quiet consistency. His notes filled a modest bundle of parchment, reflections, prayers, and recollections of a life that had once seemed too vast to grasp. Sometimes the villagers would see him sitting outside in the evening light, pen in hand, eyes distant. They assumed he was making records of crops or trade. None knew that he was, in his own way, chronicling redemption. And though he would never call himself a monk, a scholar, or a writer, he had found in those small pages the only form of peace that endures, the peace of understanding one's own story. The days grew longer again, though he scarcely noticed the seasons as sharply as he once had. Time, once measured by the urgency of campaigns and the turning of banners, had softened into an unbroken rhythm. The rise of light, the fall of dusk, the faint toll of a distant bell. Yet within that silence, memories began to stir, faint as echoes across a valley. At first they came only in fragments, uninvited and uncertain. The clatter of hooves against wet earth, the creak of leather armor tightening across his chest, the sharp command of a voice he once obeyed without hesitation. These recollections did not appear as full scenes, but as sensations detached from context. The sound of steel cutting through air, the weight of a shield, the heavy scent of blood mingled with rain. In the soft glow of candlelight, he sometimes closed his eyes and let the images come. The faces, though, they eluded him. Lords, comrades, even enemies, all had blurred into mist. He could recall how they moved, the cadence of their orders, the colors of their cloaks, but their faces were gone, as though time itself had chosen to erase the details of what once mattered most. He realized then that memory did not preserve, it transformed. It shaped what it kept, sanding away the edges of pain and pride, until only impressions remained. The more he tried to recall exact moments, the more they dissolved. What stayed were not the victories or defeats, but the sensations, the heat of armor in the sun, the distant whinny of a frightened horse, the silence that followed a trumpet's final note. Sometimes he would wake at night to the echo of his own past, the ringing of imagined steel, or the distant roar of men shouting through fog. For a moment he would lie still, heart beating slow but heavy, unsure if the sounds were real, or simply his mind replaying an unfinished song. He began to understand that memory had become both his companion and his burden. It followed him everywhere, not as a punishment, but as a shadow of what had once given him meaning. During his walks along the river, he would trace with his cane the faint tracks left by deer or boar, studying how quickly the rain erased them. He thought of how memory was much the same, impressions left upon the soil of the mind, soon to be washed away by the quiet persistence of time. Yet there were moments, fleeting but real, when the past returned with startling clarity. The cry of a crow might bring back the call of a war horn. The rustle of wind through trees might sound like the rush of banners unfurling. The world around him whispered in the language of what once was, and he listened, neither resisting nor seeking. In the evenings he sometimes reopened his old writings, the notes he had begun at the monastery. The ink had faded slightly, the pages smelling faintly of wax and smoke. He read his own words as though they belonged to someone else, and perhaps they did. The man who had written them had been closer to the noise, closer to the edge of conflict and meaning. The one who read them now was content to watch life unfold at a distance. He began to see his memories not as wounds but as relics, pieces of an ancient relic that no longer fit the world. Each recollection was a fragment of a civilization now gone, a feudal age fading into the order of towns, markets, and laws. He himself was an artifact, and memory was the dust that gathered upon him. Sometimes villagers would stop by his cottage, a miller with a question about taxes, a child with a broken toy. They called him Sir still, out of habit more than reverence, but to most he was a quiet figure at the edge of the woods, kind, reserved, useful in times of trouble. They knew little of what he had been, and he never offered the story. It was easier to let the silence hold what the words could not. In the rare moments when he spoke of the past, he did so without drama. We rode north, he might say, or it rained for 3 days before the fighting began. But even as he said it, he wondered if those things had truly happened to him, or if they were echoes borrowed from a man who had long ceased to exist. The village priest once asked if he regretted the life he had lived. The knight thought carefully before answering. "Regret fades," he said, "but memory lingers. Sometimes it feels heavier than armor." The priest nodded, as if he understood, though few could. He came to accept that memory was not a weight to be cast off, but something to be carried gently, like an heirloom that no longer served its purpose but remained precious for what it once meant. He learned to sit with it, to let it speak when it wished, to allow the images of war and loyalty and loss to drift through his mind like distant smoke. There were nights when he would step outside to feel the cool air and listen to the river. He would think of the countless men who had fought, lived, and vanished. Men whose names no chronicler had written down. Their stories were lost, as his one day would be. But in the great stillness of the world, he found that this did not trouble him. Perhaps it was better so, that memory like mist should fade into the morning. And so the past became a quiet companion, no longer haunting, no longer pleading for remembrance. He carried it as he carried his breath, a part of him, invisible, continuous, and lightened only by acceptance. As autumn came again, he watched the leaves darken and fall, each one twisting through the air like a fragment of something once whole. Watching them descend, he understood that even memory must eventually return to the earth. What remained was not the battle or the victory, but the rhythm, the eternal turning of all things toward peace. The bells of the nearby abbey reached his cottage at dawn, drifting faintly through the mist, as if carried on the breath of the valley itself. He had grown used to their rhythm, the measured toll that divided the day into hours of prayer, work, and rest. Yet one morning, as he sat by his window sharpening an old scythe, the sound felt different, not merely distant, but vast, as though it no longer belonged to the small community it served, but to something greater, something reshaping the very world around him. In his youth, the sound of bells had meant other things. They had called men to arms, marked victories, or told for the dead after battle. But now, they summoned no banners, no swords, no warriors. They called instead to faith, a power quieter, but far more enduring than any lord's command. The knight had lived long enough to see the balance of his world shift. Where once the nobility ruled through strength and lineage, now the church ruled through belief. Castles that had once been symbols of earthly dominion stood in disrepair, ivy creeping up their crumbling walls. In their place, cathedrals rose from the earth, immense luminous structures of stone and glass, reaching heavenward with an ambition that no fortress could match. He saw this transformation, not through journeys, but through whispers, stories brought by travelers and pilgrims who passed through the village. They spoke of Chartres and Canterbury, of great spires piercing the sky, of entire towns gathering for the laying of a single cornerstone. Stonecutters, who once built battlements, now carved saints. Smiths who once forged swords now shaped bells and candelabra. In this new world, faith had become the unifying law, and the clergy, its keepers. Lords and knights bowed now not before kings, but before bishops and abbots, their authority blessed not by blood, but by the church's hand. The knight did not resist this change. There was nothing left in him that yearned for power or defiance, yet he did not entirely belong to it either. He would sit sometimes outside the small village chapel and watch as peasants entered for mass, their heads bowed, their hands rough and red from labor. Inside, the priest's voice carried in solemn Latin, rising and falling in a cadence as ordered as any battle formation he had once followed. It struck him how similar the two worlds were, and yet how different in spirit. Both had hierarchies, oaths and rituals, but while the old feudal bonds had been bound by fear and loyalty, this new order was bound by hope and salvation. The lords had demanded obedience in life. The church promised reward in death. He found himself wondering which was kinder. At times, as he listened to sermons, he would feel a faint stirring of reverence, not for the words, but for the architecture of them, the discipline of belief. He respected its structure, the same way he once respected the strict lines of a military campaign. The church had done what no army could. It had conquered the human heart without bloodshed, yet still something in him hesitated. His faith, like his memory, had become slow and contemplative, not lost but unhurried, wary of certainty. He prayed, yes, but in his own way, by walking the fields at dusk, by offering bread to a beggar, by tending the graves behind the chapel when no one else would. He believed not in absolution, but in endurance, in the quiet dignity of living well, even after all purpose had faded. Once, on a pilgrimage road that passed near the village, a group of young monks stopped to rest. Their leader, not much older than a squire, spoke passionately about the coming of a new age, a world bound not by steel but by scripture. The knight listened without judgment. When the monk asked him if he rejoiced in this divine transformation, the knight simply replied, "I have seen many orders rise. The old ones fall quietly, like leaves." The young monk smiled, not unkindly, and said, "Then perhaps you are wiser than those who built both." The knight did not answer. He watched as they continued down the road, their sandals scuffing the dust, their chants dissolving into the breeze. In the years that followed, he watched the village itself change beneath this growing faith. A small chapel became a church. The cross replaced the coat of arms that once hung in the square. Children learned prayers before they learned their letters. Fewer men trained with spears, more learned to read scripture. And when the harvest failed or a storm struck, they no longer called upon their absent lords for aid. They sought comfort in the priest's words. It was, he thought, a different kind of fealty, one that demanded surrender not of the body, but of the soul. He wondered sometimes if this faith too would fade one day, not in his lifetime, perhaps, but in some distant age, when cathedrals would crumble as castles had. It seemed to him that every human order, no matter how devout, carried within it the seeds of its own impermanence. Still, as the years deepened, he found solace in the stillness that faith inspired in others, even if it did not wholly live in him. He would stand at the edge of the churchyard at dusk, watching candlelight glow faintly through stained glass, the voices within rising in fragile harmony. The sound no longer reminded him of battle or command. It reminded him of surrender, the quiet kind born of acceptance rather than defeat. One winter evening he was asked to help repair the wooden doors of the church. As he worked alongside the village carpenter, he noticed the carvings, saints, angels, vines, etched into the wood. He ran his hand across them, feeling their grooves beneath his calloused fingers. The craftsmanship was meticulous, reverent. It struck him that the hands which carved such things had once, perhaps, wielded weapons like his own. When the work was done, he stood back to admire it. The doors gleamed faintly in the firelight, and he thought of all the thresholds he had crossed in his life, the gates of fortresses, the entrances to tents and halls, each marking some duty, some oath. But this doorway led nowhere he had ever been, to a peace not born of victory, but of surrender. And so he stayed there a while longer, his breath visible in the cold air, listening to the bells call out again, steady, eternal, without ambition. Their sound no longer belonged to the world he once knew, but he had learned at last how to listen without needing to belong. In the dim light of late afternoon, when the sun lingered low and golden upon the edges of things, the armor caught the faintest gleam, a last, reluctant echo of what it once had been. It stood in the far corner of his cottage, near the small hearth, where time and air had done their slow, unhurried work. The steel, once polished to a mirrored sheen, had darkened into a mottled grey-green. Rust traced delicate filigrees across the breastplate. Moss had crept into the joints of the greaves where dampness gathered. It smelled faintly of earth and age, less a weapon's scent than that of a forgotten garden. He had not worn it in many years. At first he had kept it ready, oiled and inspected, as though some distant horn might still one day call him to ride again. But no horn came. The land no longer needed knights, and his strength no longer suited battle. Gradually, care gave way to neglect, and neglect to acceptance. The armor became an object rather than a possession, something that existed beside him, not for him. Sometimes in the evenings when the fire burned low, he would look toward it and think of how much it had once weighed, not just on his shoulders, but upon his soul. The armor had been more than protection. It had been identity. Every clang of its plates, every mark polished from its surface, had declared who he was and what he owed. It had bound him to oaths, to lords, to wars, to world that no longer existed. Now it stood silent, the last monument of that vanished order. Children of the village who came to fetch water or deliver kindling sometimes asked him about it. To them it looked like the shell of a creature from an old tale, heavy, mysterious, faintly tragic. He would tell them only that it belonged to another time, a time when men believed that courage could be worn like metal. They would nod, half understanding, before running off to their games, leaving him alone again with the relic. He never thought to sell it, though he had sold many things in his life. Horses, swords, even land. The armor remained. Not because it was valuable, but because it was sacred in the quiet, private sense of the word. It was not an heirloom to be passed down, nor a symbol to be displayed. It was a memory made solid. To part with it would be to deny the years it had witnessed, the version of himself it had once held together. When storms passed through the valley, the wind would sometimes find its way through the cracks in the cottage walls, whistling faintly against the armor's edges. The sound was low, metallic, and strangely human, as though the suit itself were sighing. In those moments he would glance toward it, and feel both affection and distance. He could no longer imagine lifting its weight, strapping its buckles, feeling its chill against his skin. The thought of riding into battle now seemed as remote and unreal as a legend recited by another voice. Once, when the autumn rains had been particularly relentless, he decided to clean it again, not out of duty, but nostalgia. He carried each piece outside and laid them in the grass. The metal was rough and pitted. Flakes of rust broke off in his hands. As he worked with cloth and oil, he saw how the sun caught on the dull surface, lighting it in warm, uneven patterns. It no longer reflected clearly. Instead it glowed softly, as though the metal had learned humility. He did not try to restore it fully. The damage was too deep, and besides, perfection no longer seemed desirable. The armor's decay was honest. It told the story of years that could not be unwritten. The long winters, the quiet neglect, the slow surrender of strength. When he finished, he set the helmet back upon its stand and stepped back to look at it. For a moment he thought it resembled a head bowed in prayer. The villagers sometimes asked him why he kept it when it could serve no purpose. He would only say, "It reminds me to stay light." They would smile politely, not understanding. Yet for him, the armor's presence was a lesson, a constant reminder that what once protected can also imprison. and that freedom sometimes begins with letting go of one's own weight. In the early mornings, before the day's labor began, he would sometimes sit by the open door and watch the mist rise from the river, drifting through the trees like breath. The armor caught that same pale light, and for a brief moment it looked almost new again, as though memory itself had polished it. Then the sun would rise higher, and the illusion would fade, leaving behind only the truth of time. The truth was simple. Iron rusts, flesh weakens, oaths dissolve, yet from that decay, a different kind of peace emerges, one not forged by struggle but by acceptance. As winter approached once more, he covered the armor with a simple cloth to keep the dust away. The gesture was not one of reverence, but of tenderness. It felt like placing a blanket over an old friend. He realized then that he no longer mourned the world that had vanished. The past had not been lost, it had simply gone to rest. And in that quiet corner of his cottage, beneath the muted folds of linen, his armor, once the loudest part of his existence, slept at last. It was early spring when the sound returned, not the echo of bells or wind through the trees, but the unmistakable cadence of marching feet. It reached him faintly at first, through the soft mist that hung above the river, a steady rhythm that stirred something deep within his bones. He stepped out from his cottage, leaning on his cane, and looked toward the old road that wound through the valley. The sound grew clearer, the synchronized stamp of boots, the dull rattle of carts, the distant jangle of bridles and harnesses. Yet there was something strange in the music of it, familiar in form but foreign in tone. When the first column appeared over the rise, the knight's breath caught. These were soldiers, yes, but not like any he had ever known. Their armor was not steel but fabric and leather. Their colors were uniform, not heraldic. No banners fluttered in the wind, only a single flag bearing a simple emblem of a kingdom, now more centralized, more bureaucratic, more impersonal than any he had served. Their weapons gleamed, but not with the polished artistry of a sword. Long iron barrels glinted in the light, muskets, primitive yet powerful, their smoke-stained ends promising a kind of death far colder and less noble than the one he had known. He stood quietly by the roadside as they passed. Some of the younger soldiers glanced toward him, at his grey beard, his weathered face, and perhaps at the faint trace of an old bearing he still carried unconsciously. One or two nodded, not in salute, but in curiosity. To them he must have seemed like a relic, a living monument from the age of lances and shields. Behind them rolled small cannons drawn by horses, the new thunder of war. When the wind shifted, he could smell the faint tang of gunpowder. It was not the metallic scent of swordplay he remembered, but something sharper, acrid, impersonal. A smell not of men clashing hand to hand, but of distance, of killing done across fields rather than face to face. He watched the young officer at their head, a man perhaps in his mid-20s, clean-shaven, with a feathered hat and a saber at his side, more for ceremony than combat. The young soldier rode with easy confidence, not with the pride of lineage, but with the assurance of one trained by rule, not by tradition. He carried no crest, no family sigil, no sacred vow. His authority came not from feudal honor, but from the hierarchy of command, an order of discipline rather than devotion. As the column moved past the village, the peasants gathered by the roadside watching with awe. The thunder of the new age rolled by them in neat formation, drums marking time, wheels creaking under heavy loads of powder and shot. It was war made mechanical, stripped of pageantry, governed by mathematics rather than valor. The knight felt no bitterness, only a vast hollow understanding. He had lived long enough to witness the death of the very thing that had once defined him. War itself had shed its skin. The sword was giving way to the musket. Courage was being replaced by coordination. The battlefield was no longer a place of personal valor, but of collective precision. He thought of his own campaigns, the rush of horses, the flash of sunlight on blades, the chaos and intimacy of close combat. In those days, a man's fate could still be determined by his own strength, his own choice in a moment of fury or mercy. But this new order left little room for such things. Here men would die by commands they never heard, by projectiles they never saw. The field had become a place of calculation, not courage. When the army had nearly passed, one of the soldiers, perhaps moved by curiosity, approached him briefly. He wore a blue coat with brass buttons, his musket slung over his shoulder. He looked barely older than the boys who helped tend the village fields. "Were you a soldier once?" the young man asked. The knight nodded slowly. "Long ago," he said. The soldier smiled faintly. "Then you understand," he replied, before jogging to rejoin his company. But the knight did not understand, not fully, not this kind of war. He watched as the regiment disappeared down the road, leaving behind ruts in the mud and the faint smell of spent powder. The village children chased after them for a while, laughing, their voices fading as the sound of marching feet dissolved into the distance. That night, he sat by his hearth and thought of what he had seen. The world had changed before. Lords had fallen, faith had risen, castles had turned to ruins. But this change felt deeper. It was not only the tools of war that had evolved, but the soul of it. The new armies fought not for fealty or faith, but for nations, vast, abstract entities beyond any man's understanding. The age of personal honor had yielded to the age of systems. He looked at his rusted armor in the corner, covered still by its cloth. It seemed smaller now, almost delicate. Once it had been the pinnacle of human craft, now it was obsolete. Yet he did not pity it. He saw in it a quiet dignity, a reminder of when men still looked their enemies in the eye, when courage and mortality shared the same space. The next morning, when the echoes of the soldiers' drums had long faded, he walked the road they had taken. The ruts from the wheels were still there, and in one he found a small brass button stamped with the insignia of their company. He turned it over in his palm, smooth, cold, industrial. It had none of the artistry of the knightly age, but it was functional, efficient, inevitable. He kept it, placing it beside his old sword on the mantelpiece. 2 ages of war, one forged by hand, the other by design, resting quietly side by side. The contrast did not sadden him. It only reminded him that everything, in time, becomes what it must. The sword had ruled until it could rule no longer. The gun would do the same, and one day, perhaps, even that too would fall silent. As he stood at his doorway, listening to the stillness return, he felt no fear of what was coming, only a quiet gratitude that he had lived long enough to see the world change, and to step aside from it without bitterness. The knight turned back toward his hearth, his cane tapping lightly against the worn floorboards. Outside, the sky deepened toward evening, and for a long moment he thought he could still hear the faint echo of drums, not menacing, not mournful, just distant, fading into history. The morning was grey and still when the knock came, soft but certain, 3 measured taps upon the weathered door. The knight, now stooped and slow with age, looked up from the hearth where the fire burned low. Such visitors were rare in this quiet village, rarer still for a man so long forgotten by the world. He rose carefully, leaning on his cane, and pulled open the door. There stood a young messenger on horseback, mud spattered on his cloak, the cold mist clinging to his hair. The horse breathed steam into the morning air, stamping restlessly. The boy, for he was barely more than that, held out a sealed parchment with both hands, bowing slightly, as if unsure whether the old man before him was the one he sought. "Sir," he said, hesitating, "I was told to deliver this to a Sir Aldrich of Kellenford." The knight blinked at the sound of his name, a name unused for decades, one he'd almost forgotten was his own. "Aldrich," he murmured softly, as if testing the weight of it. Then he nodded. "That was me, long ago." The boy handed him the parchment, sealed with red wax bearing a faint impression of a crest he recognized, or thought he did. It had been the sigil of his family, once a silver stag upon a field of green. But the lines were different now, the stag stylized, modernized, stripped of its old heraldic grace. Even the emblem had moved on. "Who sent this?" he asked. "I was told only to deliver it from the manor of Kellenford," the boy replied. "There's a new lord now, Sir Edric of Westmere. He said you would understand." The knight nodded slowly, dismissing the messenger with a coin and a word of thanks. The boy rode off, leaving the old man standing in the cold with the sealed letter in his hand. For a long while, he simply stared at it, at the wax, the crest, the faded edges of the parchment. It was as if the past itself had reached across time to tap him on the shoulder. He sat at his table by the window and broke the seal. The parchment crackled faintly as he unfolded it, the handwriting neat but unfamiliar. "To Sir Aldrich of Kellenford, I write to you as the new custodian of lands once under your charge. It has come to my attention, through the surviving records of inheritance, that you were once sworn knight to the late Lord Theobald. In accordance with the revised registers, your line holds nominal mention among the former vassals of Kellenford. I write out of courtesy to inform you that these holdings, having long fallen into disuse, are now formally consolidated under the new estate of Westmere. I enclose with this letter the acknowledgement of your service, recorded for posterity, and the assurance that your name shall remain, if only in note, among the lists of our noble forebears. In good faith, Sir Edric of Westmere." At the bottom, in smaller writing, was a clerk's addition: "Sir Aldrich's line, extinguished. Heirs none recorded." He read the letter twice, perhaps 3 times, before folding it carefully and setting it upon the table. There was no anger in him, only an immense hollow quiet. The words were courteous, polite, official, but beneath them was a simple truth. The world no longer remembered him. His name, once spoken with command on the field, had become a mere annotation in a ledger. His service, once sworn under banners and oaths, now existed as a line in a document destined to gather dust in some distant archive. He was not even a figure of history, just a footnote beneath the story of another man's inheritance. He rose and walked slowly to the window. The mist had thickened outside, curling through the trees and across the riverbank. Somewhere beyond those woods, the old Kellenford lands still lay, though likely changed, fenced and farmed by hands that had never heard of him. The manor, where he'd once served his lord, would now be rebuilt or gone entirely, its stones scattered into the fields. He wondered for a moment if any trace of his life still lingered there, perhaps the remains of a wall he'd defended, or a chapel where he'd prayed before battle. Maybe even his old banner, tattered, but kept in some storeroom by accident rather than reverence. But he doubted it. The world had little use for relics of forgotten men. As he stared out, the letter's words began to settle differently in his mind. He realized it was not a message of loss, but of completion. His name was fading. Yes, but it was fading naturally, as all things must. The letter was simply the last echo, the closing of a book whose final page had been written long ago. He thought of how many men he had seen rise and fall, lords, kings, comrades. Each had believed their deeds immortal, their names destined to outlast stone. Yet time had claimed them all, quietly, gently, until only fragments remained. Perhaps this too was grace, to vanish not in fire or battle, but in peace, folded into the rhythm of history, like a leaf carried downstream. He took up a piece of parchment and began to write his own letter, not as a reply, but as something to leave behind. His handwriting was slow and uneven, but steady. "To whoever finds this, know that once I served as knight to Lord Theobald of Kellenford. My sword has long been set aside, my armour rusted to silence. The years have taken more than they have given, yet I bear no bitterness. The land, I think, remembers in its own way, in the furrows of the fields, in the stones beneath the plough, in the songs the wind carries over the hills. If my name fades, let it fade kindly, for in the end no man owns memory. It is the earth that keeps the truest record of all." He sealed the letter without a name, placing it beside the hearth where the flames licked softly at the edges of wood. Then he took the official document, the one from Westmere, and tucked it into the folds of his old cloak. It felt strange, comforting even, to hold the weight of it, not because it mattered, but because it marked the end of something that once had. That night, as snow began to fall, he stepped outside and stood beneath the stars. The flakes settled on his shoulders and hair, each one melting into his warmth before disappearing. He looked toward the horizon, toward the lands that had once been his charge, and whispered a quiet farewell, not to the place, but to the name that had bound him to it. When he returned inside, the fire had burned low, and the room glowed faintly in the dim red light. The parchment on the table fluttered once in the draught from the door, then lay still. The world had spoken to him one last time, and now, at last, it was silent. The winters had grown gentler over the years, or perhaps it was only that his body had grown too weary to measure their bite. The cold no longer stung as it once did, it merely settled around him, soft and absolute, like a shroud laid by familiar hands. His cottage, small and low-roofed, stood at the edge of the village, half hidden beneath a tangle of bare trees. Inside, a single candle flickered beside the hearth, its light bending faintly with every slow breath of wind that found its way through the cracks in the stone. He sat close to the flame, wrapped in a rough wool cloak that had seen too many seasons. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke, dried herbs and old iron, the scent of long life reduced to its simplest elements. His sword still hung upon the wall, dulled by time but clean, and the armor beneath its cloth cover rested in shadow like a silent witness. They no longer belonged to this age, nor did he. Outside, frost crept across the window panes, tracing delicate white veins that glowed when the candlelight touched them. He watched it form and fade, the slow dance of freezing air and fragile heat. The sound of the river beyond the fields had grown faint under a skin of ice. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked once, and then all was still. It was a peaceful world now, though it was not his. The village had grown, that much he had seen even from his small corner of it. New houses with tiled roofs, straight roads marked with carts instead of hooves, the rhythmic hum of industry where once there had been only fields and silence. People spoke of trade routes, taxes, and the will of distant kings rather than oaths, banners, or battles. It was not an unkind world, only a different one. He thought often of how strange it was to live long enough to become a remnant of something no one remembered. Once he had believed that the life of a knight was eternal, that the code of chivalry, the order of service, would endure as long as men drew breath. Yet all of it had gone quietly, without ceremony, without protest. The world had simply turned its gaze elsewhere. Sometimes the younger villagers would come to him for advice. They called him Old Sir, though they knew nothing of the title's meaning. They brought him bread or broth in the harshest months, and in return he would tell them about the stars, about the habits of horses, about the way to mend a broken strap with patience instead of haste. He never spoke of battles anymore. The words would have sounded strange, almost impolite, in this gentler age. He no longer dreamed of war, though its echoes visited him sometimes in the half-sleep of early dawn. He would hear the distant sound of hooves striking wet ground, the muffled clash of armor, the shout of a banner's name. But the faces were gone, even his own among them. When he woke, there was only the stillness of morning, the faint smell of frost and smoke. He had grown accustomed to that stillness. It no longer felt empty. In its quiet there was a fullness, something like peace. He found beauty now in the smallest things, the way sunlight spilled through a crack in the shutter, the pattern of snow melting slowly on the sill, the faint creak of timbers as the cottage settled in the wind. These were his companions now, the simple rhythms of a world content to keep him company without demanding anything in return. His hands, once steady and strong, now trembled when he wrote. Still he kept a small journal near the hearth. Each night he added a few lines, not of memory, but of observation. He wrote about the frost patterns, the behavior of crows, the colors of winter skies. His words were careful, deliberate, like prayers without doctrine. They were the record of a man learning to see the world not through the eyes of duty, but of quiet wonder. Sometimes he would think of the great cathedrals being built in distant cities, towers of stone and glass rising toward heaven. Once, such things would have stirred him to awe or envy. Now they seemed to him like reflections of human longing, beautiful but unnecessary. The divine, he thought, was not above but around, in the rhythm of snow, the patience of rivers, the simple warmth of a candle flame. One night, as the first snow of the season began to fall, he opened his door and watched it drift down in silence. The flakes landed on his cloak and hair, dissolving before they could linger. The air was sharp, but not cruel. He thought of all the winters he had lived through, the marches across frozen fields, the sieges, the nights spent under open skies beside dying fires. This winter felt different. It was not something to endure, but something to receive. He stepped back inside and closed the door. The room glowed faintly, the candle nearing its end. The flame wavered, then steadied, casting long shadows on the walls where his sword and armor rested. He realized then that he was no longer the man who had worn them, nor even the man who had set them aside. He had become something quieter, a keeper of silence, a remnant of time's gentle erosion. He sat down once more, pulling the cloak around his shoulders. The candle's light reflected faintly in his eyes, soft and distant. He could feel the warmth of it on his face, the faint hum of life that still clung to him. Outside, the snow fell heavier. The world was white, hushed, suspended between seasons. He thought of how strange it was that peace, when it finally came, was not a gift from kings or victories, but from surrender, from learning to exist without being needed. When the candle finally burned low, he watched it with calm eyes. The flame flickered once, twice, and then went out, leaving the room wrapped in a quiet that was neither lonely nor dark. The frost on the window gleamed faintly in the moonlight. And there, in the stillness of his final winter, the knight rested, not as hero or relic, but as part of the quiet world he had once defended. When the first warmth of spring touched the valley, the villagers found his cottage silent. The door stood half open, creaking faintly in the morning wind, and the hearth had long gone cold. Inside, the air smelled of extinguished smoke and time. The old knight sat where he had always sat, still and peaceful, his cloak wrapped about him as if asleep. The candle beside him had burned down to its base, leaving a small pool of hardened wax that caught the sunlight in a pale shimmer. They buried him quietly, without ceremony, as he would have wished. There was no priest to recite his lineage, no banner to flutter in the wind, no kin to mourn. Only the villagers stood there, a few men who had once sought his advice, a boy who had helped him carry water, a woman who sometimes left bread by his door. They did not know the full story of who he had been. To them he was simply the old man by the river, the one who spoke softly and carried the weight of something ancient. They chose a small rise near the water for his grave, a place where the sun reached early and the soil was kind. The earth was damp with thaw, dark and fragrant. When they laid him down, they placed his sword beside him, not because they understood its meaning, but because it felt right. It was a long, worn blade, the hilt wrapped in leather that had dried and cracked with age. The edge was dulled, the metal clouded by rust, but it still carried the dignity of its years. Over the grave they set a simple stone, uncarved and unmarked. It was heavy but not monumental, a shape of quiet permanence. The villagers stood for a while, heads bowed not in reverence but in thought. Then one by one they left, their footsteps fading into the soft earth. By evening only the wind remained, whispering through the reeds. The seasons turned, as they always do. Spring's first blooms gave way to summer's fullness. The fields brightened, the river ran clear. Children played near the grave without knowing whose rest it guarded. The stone gathered moss, and in autumn fallen leaves drifted around it like coins of gold. By winter the mound was hidden under snow, indistinguishable from the land around it. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The cottage by the river collapsed first, its timbers softened by rain, its roof caved in beneath the weight of years. The path that led to it vanished beneath new growth. The village itself changed names, rebuilt and forgotten, swallowed by time's quiet appetite. Only the river remained constant, tracing its patient course through the valley as it always had, washing past the low rise where the night slept. The world above changed beyond recognition. Castles crumbled to ruins, their stones scavenged for farms and bridges. Great wars were fought with fire and thunder, far beyond anything he could have imagined. The age of chivalry became a legend, then a lesson, then a mere curiosity of scholars. His name, once carved upon shields and spoken in oath, dissolved into the silence between records. And yet, the land remembered. One autumn many centuries later, men digging near the river unearthed a strange fragment of metal. It was curved and darkened, fused with the soil. At first they thought it the remains of a broken tool, but as they dug further more pieces appeared, the faint outline of a male shirt rusted through, the trace of a sword's hilt buried in the roots of an old oak. They brought the fragments to light with care, laying them upon cloth. The iron had long surrendered its strength, flaking at the slightest touch. The sword's blade was half-eaten by rust, the chainmail fused into clumps of orange and brown. No inscription remained, no symbol to tell whose these had been. Scholars came years later to study the find. They wrote of an unidentified knight of the late medieval period, of burial customs near the lower river valleys of Old Mercia, of possible local feudal dissolution. The words were precise, measured, detached, the language of history attempting to give order to what time had made indistinct. They could not know his story. They could not know of the banner lowered long ago, the hall gone silent, the long years of wandering and solitude. They saw only fragments, metal and soil, relics without a name, and yet in a strange way that anonymity was fitting. He had lived his last years without title, without lord, without claim to remembrance. Now the earth kept him exactly as he had lived, quiet, unadorned, at peace. The archaeologists took the artifacts to a small museum in a nearby town. There, behind glass, they rested under careful light. Visitors passed by, reading the plaque that offered only speculation. Armor fragments, circa 14th century, discovered near the River Kellen, unknown knight. Children pressed their faces to the glass, marveling at the shape of the old sword, at how heavy it must have been to wield. Few lingered long. There were brighter exhibits nearby, grander histories to learn. Outside, beyond the walls of the museum, the river still flowed. Its waters ran clear and slow, glinting under the same sun that had once touched the knight's armor. The mound where his body lay was no longer marked, no longer remembered, yet each spring the grass grew thicker there, greener somehow than in the surrounding fields. Perhaps it was the soil, rich with the memory of a man who had once guarded it with his life, or perhaps the earth, in its quiet way, never truly forgets those who surrendered themselves to it fully. And so, beneath that nameless rise by the river, the last remnants of a knight without a lord continued their long sleep. His name had faded, his lineage erased, but his peace endured, a silence beyond honor or glory, beyond history itself. Above him the wind moved through the grass. The seasons turned once more, the world went on, and the knight who had once fought for others, then lived for no one, finally belonged entirely to the earth.